Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. On the morning of Friday, October 3rd, 2003, 32-year-old Dave King had just left a gym in Hodgston when a white transit van slowed as it drove past. At that moment, the passenger of the vehicle leant out of the window and fired 26 rounds from an AK-47, 5 of which hit King, killing him instantly. A known drug dealer and violent enforcer, Dave Rolex King was part of a drug trafficking organization that was bringing in hundreds of thousands of pounds of heroin into the UK. But King's fate was sealed when his criminal associates suspected him of being a police informer and hatched a plan to eliminate him. The Essex Connection. During the 1990s, a small group of criminals ruled the drug scene around Essex and East London, flooding the streets and nightclubs with ecstasy and cocaine. This operation was run by 3 drug dealers, Tony Tucker, Pat Tate and Craig Rolfe, known collectively as the Essex Boys. It was during the early 1990s that Glaswegian gangster Dave King first came into contact with Tony Tucker, who at that time operated a North London shop selling muscle-building supplements. The two men bonded over a shared interest in bodybuilding and soon developed a friendship. At 6 feet 3 inches, the muscular King was an intimidating presence and was more than capable of handling himself in a violent situation. The two men worked together as minders for ex-WBC super middleweight boxing champion Nigel Benn and enjoyed the attention and access to celebrities that came with the job. Tucker also ran a lucrative security business that provided bouncers for clubs around Essex and East London, which netted him upwards of £1,500 a week. King earned himself a fearsome reputation as a good fighter working the doors, where the sale of drugs to nightclubbers was tightly controlled. During this time, King was sentenced to a prison term for violently assaulting a man in Stevenage and hiding his victim inside the boot of a car. During his time in prison, Tony Tucker was murdered along with his criminal associates Pat Tate and Craig Rolfe. The 3 men were found shot to death in a Range Rover that was parked down a small farm track in the village of Rettendon in Essex. Rolfe had been blasted in the side of the head, while Tucker's face had been obliterated. In the back seat, Pat Tate had been shot once in the stomach and twice in the head. This crime that became known as the Rettendon Murders. Canning Town Firm. Upon his release from prison, King joined up with another criminal organization, known as the Canning Town Firm. He became close friends with one of its members, Darren Pearson, a violent, crazed individual who was connected to dangerous football hooligan gangs. As described by former Essex boy gang member turned crime author Bernard O'Mahony, Pearman was a particularly violent individual. Darren Pearman was a member of the Canning Town Firm, probably the best little outfit in London. It was all part of the same group of people as the Inner City Firm, which was centered on the West Ham fans gang. They were all very violent. If someone stamped on their foot, they got murdered. Darren was a space job. He wore cardigans and had his hair in a side parting. He looked like a boffin, but was a raging lunatic. He was friends with Dave King, and a couple of years ago, they were in Charlie Chan's nightclub. There was a fight in which a man was cut by a bottle of glass. The glassing kicked off a big fight, and the doorman got involved. One of them was an ex-wrestler called Ronnie Fuller. Ronnie didn't know the rules. If you're a doorman and you grab people like Pearman and King, you're going to get it as well, because they have to keep their front. It rumored, according to underworld sources, that 27-year-old Pearman's death was the result of an argument started by King at the Charlie Chan's North London nightclub, which ended with Ronnie Fuller, the then head doorman, forcibly ejecting both men from the establishment. Exactly 4 years to the day before his own death, King and Pearman were at the Epping Forest Country Club near Chigwell, Essex, when Pearman saw Fuller at the country club. A few weeks later, they clashed with him again outside Epping Forest Country Club, said O'Mahony. Sources state that the row stemmed from a dispute Pearman and Fuller were having over a girl, and there had been a previous fight in which Fuller had gotten the better of Pearman. Another fight soon broke out. According to eyewitnesses, Pearman's gang attacked Mr. Fuller with weapons, including a machete. This had been hidden in a sofa inside the club. During the scuffle, Fuller wrestled the weapon from Pearman, who sustained fatal injuries. O'Mahony said, Pearman was stabbed and pronounced dead by the time he rolled up to Whipps Cross Hospital in the back of a cab. Pearman's brother was also injured. Several months later, Fuller and an associate were released on police bail over the Pearman murder. On August 29, 2000, Fuller was blasted to death on the doorstep of his home by a hitman riding a motorbike. O'Mahony said, later, a motorbike hitman shot Ronnie twice in the head and 3 times in the chest, killing him outside his home in Grays, Essex, in front of his wife. According to O'Mahony, the Canning Town firm had refused to cooperate with the police investigation into Pierman's murder and announced they would sort it themselves. Ronnie Fuller had moved roughly 20 miles from Loughton, but as O'Mahony put it, it had not been nearly far enough. No one was ever tried for the murder of Ronnie Fuller. According to a police source, investigators suspected the Pierman's father, Christopher Pierman, was behind the killing in retribution for the death of his son. It was later revealed that at the time of the Pierman murder, the Epping Forest Country Club was owned by David Hunt, who is considered one of the most violent gangsters in the United Kingdom, and suspected head of the criminal organization known as the Hunt Syndicate. According to a former member of the Canning Town firm, King's presence within the gang resulted in bitter feuds. John Rawlinson said that King had angered many with his attitude. He joined up with our firm after coming out of prison, much against my better judgment. Once he did, he systematically began to turn everybody against each other, and caused a lot of bad feeling. Once former associate said of King, he was a nice fella in his own way, but you wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of him, while another said, he was a violent bully. Rolex Dave. Police investigations linked King to the lucrative London trade in stolen watches, something that earned him the sobriquet Rolex Dave. King was rumored to sell the stolen watches to the Bratva, or Russian mafia. Around this time, King began forming connections with other criminal groups. King eventually started his own nightclub in Stevenage called the Renaissance. It became known as a notorious center for drug dealing and was closed by the local council for non-payment of rent in 2002. One bar manager in the town said, it was a drugs haven. It was full of them. By the early 2000s, he expanded his criminal activities that included handling stolen property and drug dealing, and had begun trafficking large quantities of drugs into the United Kingdom. This lucrative but highly dangerous business had netted him hundreds of thousands in illicit profit, but also many enemies within the underworld. So lucrative was the drug trafficking business that King lived in a £554,000 home at Ardleigh, Herts, financed through his drug dealing and criminal activities. But Rolex Dave King knew the dangers he faced, and this was the reason why he took precautions wherever he went. One particular incident had caused King to suspect his life was in danger. In June 2002, a heroin shipment was intercepted by customs. A relatively common occurrence, however, this shipment was worth £100,000. King and 4 of his criminal associates were arrested over the 14 kilograms drug seizure. All 5 were charged with drug offenses, however proceedings against King, by then a father of 2, were dropped at an early stage. This prompted one of his co-defendants to shout in court that he was a grass, and soon caused a fallout within the criminal gang. His gangland associates had been harboring fears for some months that their firm had been infiltrated by a police or customs grass, and the ease with which King had got off pointed the finger towards him, said Detective Inspector Paul Maggie of Essex Police. D.I. Maggie said, "This is a tit-for-tat killing. King knew he had a problem, that there was a threat to his life." King took a contract out on Sharma. David Sharma, a one-time friend of King from North London, was so frightened of 6 feet 3 inches, 18 SD King, that he fled to Caen in the south of France and went into hiding under a false identity. When 2 of the other men arrested in the drug seizure along with King and Sharma, Roger Vincent and David Smith, heard about the threat to Sharma, they offered to have King shot in retaliation. Police said that was the motive for King's murder. Vincent from Penn, Bucks, and Smith, who lived in Borehamwood, Herts, contracted armed robber Dean Spencer from Manchester to carry out the hit. 31-year-old Smith armed himself with a Webley .38 pistol, loaded with 5 bullets, and went with another man to King's Stevenage home on September 22, 2003. They became convinced King was waiting for them, and knew his reputation for ruthlessness along with his powerful physique as a bodybuilder that earned him the nickname Muscles. As they suspected, King had been forewarned about a possible threat to his, and was with minder Ian Crocker. During this time, he had also taken to wearing a bulletproof vest. Outside King's home, the 4 men were locked in a standoff before Spencer lost his nerve and fled. Having pulled out of the deal, Roger Vincent became violent when he found he would have to do the job himself. Spencer was later arrested for committing an armed robbery, and under questioning told detectives about the murder plot against King. During his later trial at Luton Crown Court, it was learned he told investigators, "When I saw how big he was and wearing that bulletproof vest, I knew my little gun would be useless against him." The assassination. When Vincent, a 33-year-old gangland debt collector and fixer, heard that Spencer had bottled out, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He enlisted the help of 33-year-old David Smith, who was to act as his driver and also assist with the murder. Aware that King knew about the murder plot against him, and that he routinely took to wearing a bulletproof vest, the two men got a Hungarian-made Kalashnikov AKS-47 machine gun and loaded it with full metal jacket, armor-piercing bullets. The AKS-47, an AK-47 with a folding metal stock, is issued mainly to paratroopers and members of elite special forces. The detailed planning that followed was conducted over mobile phones, and evidence from bills was used by the police to piece together the movements and motives of the main players. With forensic evidence left by the killer, CCTV recordings, descriptions of the suspects from witnesses, surveillance and recording of conversations, police were able to put together a profile of the murder, which was later presented to the court at the trial of Vincent and Smith. Vincent and Smith used a stolen white transit van and a stolen Mercedes as getaway cars, and proceeded to stalk King until they saw their chance to kill him. This came on October 3, 2003, when Dave King left the Physical Limits Gym in Brewery Road, Hoddesdon, Hertfordshire, in the company of his bodyguard, Ian Crocker. As the two men walked outside, a white van, driven by Smith, pulled up alongside King. In that moment, he must have realized what was about to happen. Sitting in the passenger seat, Vincent opened fire on King with an AK-47 Kalashnikov assault rifle, discharging at least 26 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition. In what was described in court as a classic drive-by assassination, King was struck at close range by 5 rounds from the 3-second burst that hit him in the chest, arm, and leg. He died instantly. Other rounds peppered King's car, others his friend Ian Crocker, and others were later found in the walls of the gym. Dead Inc. Maggie said, "Some of the bullets that hit the gym went through the wall and into the gym. It was the first time that weapon was used in Britain in automatic mode." The killers then made their getaway, torching the vehicles to cover their tracks. The investigation. However, the killers failed to adequately discard of crucial evidence linking them to the crime. Close to the burnout van, police found a discarded plastic glove. Inside was a palm print of David Smith. The day following the murder, a couple were walking beside Braid-on-Water at Great Yarmouth on the Norfolk Broads. Suddenly they spotted a man hurling a red sports bag into the water, before hurriedly running away. The walkers retrieved the holdall, and inside found it contained an AKS-47 assault rifle and spare rounds of ammunition. Police were able to prove the gun, which had previously belonged to the Hungarian prison authorities, was the same one used to kill Dave King. Further evidence was recovered from the murder weapon. On the lip of the curved ammunition clip they found a trace of Smith's DNA. Meanwhile, on a towel in the same bag, forensic officers found saliva DNA from Vincent, definitively linking him to the crime. Yet further evidence was uncovered on another towel that was found to contain fibers from a unique jute rug which was at a flat used by Vincent. CCTV footage recovered by investigators placed Smith, wearing a distinctive hat, at a filling station in Hoddesdon. Mobile phones transmissions from Hoddesdon to Ken analyzed by police minutes after the shooting indicated that Vincent and Smith had called David Sharma to tell him they had murdered King. Sharma, who was wanted for his involvement in the King slaying, disappeared and was being actively hunted across Europe by Interpol. A fourth man, 38-year-old Julian Elfies, 38, from High Wycombe, Bucks, was convicted of assisting an offender, when it was proved he had helped Vincent lie low after the shooting. Arrested shortly after the killing, Vincent boasted to detectives under questioning that he made £250,000 in cash every year from a string of clubs he controls in the east of England. Vincent, who drove a £100,000 convertible Aston Martin DB7, was charged with King's murder. Assets worth £1.6 million were frozen by court order on the grounds that his funds were linked to drug trafficking and money laundering. The assets included his house in Hertfordshire, £1 million property in London, and £7,500 in 4 bank accounts. A detective said, "Whenever we talked to anyone in the underworld about Vincent, we discovered people were terrified of him. He is not a big man physically, but has a fearsome reputation for violence and as a hired gun. For his part in the murder plot, father of four Vincent was sentenced to serve at least 30 years. His criminal associate and getaway driver David Smith was sentenced to a minimum of 25 years for his part in the murder. Elfies was jailed for 5 years for assisting Vincent, while Dean Spencer admitted conspiracy to murder King and was sentenced at a later date. After they were convicted, Mr. Justice Wilkie said, "This was a thoroughly planned, ruthless, and brutally executed assassination of a criminal by a small team. It was committed in a public street during daytime and involved an automatic firearm. It was only by great fortune that no other passers-by were seriously injured or worse." The murder of Dave King had been orchestrated as part of a plot to eliminate him before he managed to kill David Sharma. The two killers were friends with Sharma and offered to wipe out King purely as a favor with no payment involved. Rolex Dave King was a dangerous individual, known for his violent tendencies and criminal activities. However, not everyone remembers him for the crimes he committed. His parents, Jimmy and Norma King, remember their Glasgow-born son as a football-crazy family man. In a statement after his death, they said, "He was ambitious for himself and for his family and wanted the very best for his children." A devout Muslim, David's bodybuilding formed a great part of his lifestyle. He was proud of his appearance and a perfectionist in all that he did. The violent death of Dave King came as a shock to the community in Hoddesdon, but in the criminal underworld, rivalries and killings are not uncommon. Despite this, a police source said, "Whatever someone's past, no one deserves to be killed like this." But it was the way of the world he operated in. Case 2. The story of Pat Tate is one of violence, drug dealing, and murder that continues to intrigue and fascinate decades after the case of the Rettendon murders, in which Tate's gang, the Essex Boys, were found blasted to death in a Range Rover. But who was Pat Tate, and how did he end up living a life of crime? Considered by one of his victims as a bully who deserved what he got, the fate of Pat Tate was inexorably linked to that of his fellow Essex Boys, who would meet their demise on a freezing and desolate country lane. Pat Tate lived a violent life, and naturally came to a violent end. But how he came to become associated with the Essex Boys, a drug-dealing group who controlled the flow of drugs in Essex, can be answered by the then-growing drug trade in the UK. Born on August 7, 1958 in Rockford, Essex, Patrick "Pat" Tate seemed to have a penchant for violence. By the time of death at the age of 37, Tate, who was 6 feet 2 and weighed 18 stone, often used his size and immense strength to intimidate anyone who stood in his way. Tate had an extensive criminal record, including convictions for drug offenses and armed robbery, and had once escaped from a courthouse at Billericay. On December 30, 1988, the 30-year-old Tate made a dramatic escape from the dock. Accused of robbery and possession of cocaine, bodybuilder Tate stood before the court. He suddenly lunged at 3 police officers, who were injured, as he powered his way out of the court towards a waiting motorcycle driven by an accomplice. One WPC received a black eye in the altercation, and another officer was kicked in the face as police tried to block Tate's escape. According to police, witnesses inside the courtroom tried to impede the police attempts to restrain Tate. In the aftermath, roadblocks were set up but failed to trap Tate, who, sporting several tattoos and wearing a fawn top, light blue jeans, and a green sweatshirt. Tate subsequently fled to Spain, but was soon extradited back when he made the mistake of going to Gibraltar. Sentenced to 7 years imprisonment, Tate spent his time inside bodybuilding. By this time, he had started taking drugs. With his already violent disposition, Tate fueled his anger with drugs. According to Bernard O'Mahony, a former member of the Canning Town firm, Tate suffered from a drug problem. Tate had a real drug addiction, he said. Upon his release on parole, he survived an attempt on his life when a hitman threw a brick through his bathroom window and shot him in the arm. Tate was rushed to hospital, and staff found he had hidden a stash of drugs and a handgun under his pillow. His license was immediately revoked, and he was sent back to prison. One man, Stephen Ellis, was questioned over the assault, but soon fled to the West County under a new identity where he took to wearing body armor out of fear of reprisals. His second-hand car business was looked after by his friend Tony Tucker, who gave him a job in his operation upon his release from prison. Tucker was running a drugs franchise operation and offered Pat Tate a position. By this time, Tate had a 2-year-old son, Jack Tate, with his girlfriend Sarah Saunders, who herself suffered violence at the hands of her partner. It was known to police that Tate domestically abused his girlfriend, and the couple split not long after his release from prison. O'Mahony said, "Look at Tate. He came out after 6 or 7 years inside, and within 5 months he was shot. 6 weeks after that, he was shot dead. 6 months he'd been out, and he was shot twice. I'm 60 and I've never been shot." O'Mahony said, "Look at Tate. He came out after 6 or 7 years inside, and within 5 months he was shot. 6 weeks after that, he was shot dead. 6 months he'd been out, and he was shot twice. I'm 60 and I've never been shot." Tate was described by his own mother as a liability who was often high on drugs, which made him paranoid and unpredictable. The night before he was murdered at Rettendon, Tate had telephoned the London Pizza Company in Basildon. He aggressively demanded a specially made pizza with 4 different toppings on each quarter. The manager, 21-year-old Roger Ryle, was busy and annoyed by the caller's attitude and so promptly hung up. Within minutes, Tate turned up at the store. There he picked up the till and smashed it against the wall, then punched Ryle and smashed his head into a glass plate on the sink of the bathroom. Ryle, like many others who encountered Tate, refused to press charges. One associate said of Tate, "A room would darken when he entered it." Another ex-girlfriend of Tate's is Lizzie Fletcher. She provided statements about Tate's behavior on the evening before his murder, offering insights into his activities and state of mind during that time. On the morning of December 7th, 1995, Ken Jiggins and his friend, Farmer Peter Theobald, came across a metallic blue Range Rover, parked in front of a locked gate on Workhouse Lane in the small village of Rettendon, Essex. Initially, the 2 men suspected the seemingly sleeping occupants might be poachers. However, as they neared, they could see that 2 men inside were dead. While Jiggins phoned police, Theobald got a closer look and saw that another man was dead in the back seat. At around 8:30 a.m. that morning, Detective Superintendent Ivan Dibley received a telephone call that a triple murder had been committed. A 40-strong squad descended on the crime scene that cold winter morning, which had been a regular spot for courting couples. The passenger was identified as Tony Tucker, Pat Tate's 38-year-old friend and business partner. He suffered a catastrophic facial injury caused by a shotgun blast that almost completely obliterated his features. In the driver's seat was 26-year-old Craig Rolfe, the 3rd member of the firm known as the Essex Boys, who had also been hit by a shotgun blast to the side of his face, leaving a large hole in the side of his head. Taken by surprise, he still had his foot on the brake pedal. The man in the back seat was Pat Tate, his head smashed through the back window after he was shot once in the head and once in the stomach. It had all the hallmarks of a cold-blooded execution, and none of the victims had time to react. Detectives began to piece together the sequence of events and determine whether the killer or killers had been seated in the Range Rover with the victims, or had ambushed the men from outside the vehicle, blasting them to death before they realized what was happening. Det Superintendent Dibley said, "This is not an ordinary murder. It looks as if they were enticed down there. As far as murders go, you don't get any more serious than this." The killer fired off 8 rounds, leaving the spent cartridges where they fell, possibly because it was too dark to retrieve them. 3 shots were fired off in quick succession, killing Rolfe, then Tucker. It was surmised that before he could react, Tate was shot in the abdomen. The gunman then reloaded the shotgun, before shooting him twice in the head, and for good measure then fired another shot each into the already dead Tucker and Rolfe. It was strongly suspected that Tate had been the prime target. The others were merely collateral damage. A post-mortem examination found Pat Tate had a combination of cocaine, heroin, and cannabis in his bloodstream, along with steroids. Investigators began looking for potential leads that might explain why these 3 men, who were considered low-level criminals, were apparently lured to late-night rendezvous where they were ambushed and shot to death. Detectives soon learned there were many reasons why certain people might want to cause harm to the 3 Essex boys. Tate in particular had made many enemies because of his violent manner, use of force, and explosive temper. Bernard O'Mahony said, "It was obvious to everyone who knew them what was going to happen. I was aware of it at the time and kept my distance. It wasn't hard. Several instances, in the months and years leading up to the Rettendon murders, were possible contributors to their deaths." Pat Tate and the Essex boys were suspected in the death of 28-year-old Kevin Whitaker, who died from an apparent drug overdose in November 1994. Whitaker was apparently murdered because of an alleged drug debt, and Tate's mother said her son told her this when she visited him in hospital after he was shot. Whitaker was found on November 17, 1994, 30 hours after going missing, his body dumped by the roadside. First indications were he died from an apparent drug overdose. It was Pat Tate's mother who began to make allegations, claiming that Tucker and Rolfe had injected Whitaker with a drug that caused his death. Marie Tate strongly believes her son was the innocent party in the crime, and that Whitaker's friends had taken revenge by killing her son and his criminal associates. However, detectives were certain it had no connection to their own murders at Workhouse Lane. Another death associated with the Essex boys was that of 18-year-old Leah Betts. The teenager, a schoolgirl from Latchington in Essex, was admitted to hospital on November 11, 1995 after falling into a coma. This occurred 1 month before the murders at Rettendon. It was found she had 4 hours previously taken an ecstasy, MDMA, tablet, and then drank approximately 7 liters of water during a 90-minute period. 5 days later she died after her life support machine was switched off. Her death was used in the British media as an example of the dangers of illegal drugs, and ecstasy in particular, something that had become common in nightclubs in Essex. In response, Essex police launched a large inquiry to locate the suppliers of the tablet Leah Betts had taken. They were able to pinpoint Raquel's club as the venue where it was bought. The subsequent investigation cost roughly £300,000. This inquiry resulted in the arrest of 4 of Leah's friends who had been present at the house. It has been suggested that Tony Tucker and Pat Tate's gang controlled the supply of ecstasy in the Basildon nightclub where the tablet had been bought. This led to the theory that the murders of the Rettendon drug dealers were revenge for the death of Leah Betts. In May 1996, a break in the case was made when 3 men were arrested during a police and customs drugs operation. 52-year-old Michael Steele, 33-year-old Jack Hooms, and a 3rd man were arrested and held on suspicion of importing drugs. These 3 men were soon linked to the Rettendon murders of Pat Tate, Tucker, and Rolfe. Facing a murder charge, one of the men, Darren Nichols, started to confess the role he played in their deaths. Nichols claimed to have met Steele, Hooms, and Tate a few years earlier while serving a prison sentence for distributing counterfeit currency at Hollesley Bay Prison in Suffolk. Upon his release, Nichols joined Steele's smuggling organization, making trips to Amsterdam. Michael Steele was considered a sophisticated Essex drug smuggler, and in November 1995, he supplied a consignment of cannabis with a street value of around £350,000 to Tate, Tucker, and Rolfe. This is considered the catalyst for the subsequent Rettendon murders. It turns out the quality of the drugs were so poor that Steele agreed to take back the cannabis and return a deposit of around £70,000. The money was paid, but Tate denied getting it and also failed to return 1/3 of the drugs haul. When Steele protested, Tate threatened to shoot him after making him beg on his knees. A furious Tate boasted he would kill the smuggler in revenge for the incident, and Steele, who had developed a close relationship with Tate's ex-girlfriend, who told him of the threats and caused him to make the first move. 6 weeks before the murders, Steele contacted Nichols and asked him to get him a gun. Shortly after, Pat Tate, Tucker, and Rolfe were invited to look at the farmer's field where, as part of their smuggling operation, the alleged drug plane would land. Nichols told police what happened next. As Rolfe's Range Rover approached the locked gate at the bottom of Workhouse Lane, Steele jumped out to open it. At the same moment, Jack Hooms, known as Steele's right-hand man, leant in with a pump-action shotgun and began blasting the 3 men inside. Moments later, Nichols was called by Hooms, asking to pick them up. As the 2 men got into the back of his car, he noticed they were spattered in blood and realized what had happened. Steele apparently said, "They want fuck with us again." When Pat Tate was found blasted to death alongside his fellow Essex boys, Tony Tucker and Craig Rolfe, arrangements were made by his family to lay him to rest. In January 1997, his flower-decked horse-drawn carriage led his coffin towards the Pitsea Church steps where the vicar waited to carry out the service. Police directed traffic as a bell tolled for the 25-minute service, during which a brother gave a touching tribute. One floral tribute said simply, "Daddy." Another card read, "Thanks for the good times. I will never forget you, your baby son Jordan." Roughly 60 mourners, close family and friends of the dead man sang, "All things bright and beautiful," and recited the 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd." Pat Tate's headstone displays all the ostentation of his funeral service and carries a photograph of him. It reads, "Treasured memories of Pat Terrence Tate, who departed this life on December 6, 1995, aged 37. Loving father, loyal friend and brother, missing your smiles and generous heart. Your presence will never leave us. Now you walk with the angels looking down from God's great kingdom. Until we meet again, God bless, we will never forget you. On its base, two white doves are seen comfort each other, and the back of the memorial reads, God found the path was growing rough, the hill too steep to climb, so he closed your eyelids and whispered, peace be thine. Pat Tate's funeral was befitting for the man who saw himself as a gangster, with the pomp and ceremony that he would have appreciated. Nichols said Steele went on to say he felt like an angel of death, because he felt he had done everyone a favor by getting rid of these three men. I think I knew all along that they were going to do it. With Nichols turning supergrass, Michael Steele and Jack Hooms went on trial in late 1997 based on his testimony. Charged with murder, Nichols said he had little choice but to help the investigation and point the finger of blame at his former friends. The trial lasted 4.5 months, and the court proceedings were believed to have cost well over £1 million. Hooms and Steele's lawyers claimed Nichols had fabricated his story. On January 20th, 1998, the jury started deliberation for 4.5 days. When they returned, guilty verdicts for both defendants were handed down. The weight of evidence had been mobile phone records used to corroborate the informant's testimony, the reliability of which were raised afterwards. Michael Steele and Jack Hooms were convicted of the 3 murders and given triple life sentences. Darren Nichols was placed in the Witness Protection Program, with new identities for him and his family. The murders of Pat Tate, his boss Tony Tucker, and their fellow Essex boy Craig Rolfe have influenced several movies about their time as one of the criminal gangs supplying drugs and exploits as dangerous hard men in the Essex criminal underworld. Case 3. On the evening of December 6, 1995, a group of young men arrived at a small farm located in the village of Rettendon in Essex. The group were headed by Tony Tucker, a businessman who provided security for clubs around Essex, who along with his associates was involved in drug dealing. By the morning, all 3 would be dead, blasted to death inside their Range Rover in what would become known as the Rettendon murders. The investigation into Tucker's death, and those of his fellow Essex boys, as the group were known, would take many years before a supergrass came forward with information on what happened that fateful night, and why the 3 men were murdered. After the conviction of the killers, doubt still lingers over who exactly pulled the trigger. Little is known of Tucker's early life and childhood. However, what is known is that he held aspirations from a young age of being a tough guy, someone who could hold their own in a fight, and who people came to fear. With a taste for expensive things, Tucker strove to get what he wanted in life, even if that meant acquiring it through illegal means. As the leader of the Essex Boys, the drug-dealing gang who operated throughout Essex during the 1990s, Anthony "Tony" Tucker was a feared figure in the criminal underworld. He operated a security business that provided personnel for clubs around Essex. It was through this line of work that Tucker came to meet boxer Nigel Benn. A bodybuilder who regularly frequented the gym, Tucker started acting as a bodyguard for Benn, alongside minder David "Rolex Dave" King. This provided Tucker with the opportunity of meeting other celebrities, ensuring the expansion of his business. He was often seen at ringside during Benn's fights, as part of his entourage. A close associate of Pat Tate, another violent Essex criminal, who spent time in prison for drug offenses and robbery. Although the pair were known for their violence, they held a measure of respect for one another. While Tate was in prison, his second-hand car business was run by his friend Tucker, who then gave Tate a job upon his release. Known for his large physical presence and violent temper, Tate was instrumental in Tucker's drugs franchise operation. Other members of Tucker's new drugs venture included Craig Rolfe, a petty criminal with a heavy cocaine habit, who acted as muscle and driver to his boss Tucker, and Carlton Leach, a former football hooligan connected with the Intercity firm, who worked as a bouncer at Essex nightclubs, becoming involved in the large-scale ecstasy dealing during the rave era of the later 1980s. It was the Tucker/Tate partnership that ensured the Essex Boys' eventual dominance over the drug trade. There were few who could stand up to their combined strength, and very often the opposition were too intimidated to defy the pair. Together they handed out punishment beatings to keep people in line, and frequently used torture against anyone who crossed them. The flow of drugs from the gang into nightclubs throughout Essex earned the Essex Boys hundreds of thousands in illicit revenue. Most of that money went on to fund the lifestyles of Tucker, Tate, Rolfe, and Leach. Although Tucker earned around £1,500 a week from his security business, he and his associates were soon enjoying lavish lifestyles. At the time of his death, Tucker was living in a £250,000 house and driving expensive cars. The sale of ecstasy pills funded the gang's drug empire. However, it proved fatal for those who consumed the deadly drug. 1 month before the deaths of the Essex boys, schoolgirl Leah Betts, from Latchington in Essex, was admitted to hospital on November 11, 1995 after falling into a coma. Only hours previously, the 18-year-old had taken an ecstasy, MDMA, tablet, and then drank approximately 7 liters of water during a 90-minute period. 5 days later she died after her life support machine was switched off. Although 4 of her friends who had present were arrested, no one was ever charged with supplying the deadly drug. Her death was used in the British media as an example of the dangers of illegal drugs, and ecstasy in particular. In response, Essex police launched a large inquiry to locate the suppliers of the tablet Leah Betts had taken. Leah had bought the tablet from Raquel's Club, a Basildon nightclub, where Tucker's gang allegedly controlled the supply of ecstasy. On the morning of December 7, 1995, 2 men discovered a seemingly abandoned Range Rover, parked in front of a locked gate leading to an angler's carp pond near the shooting area on the land of farmer Ken Jiggins, in the small village of Rettendon. That cold December morning was frosty, however the windshield of the vehicle was clear. When Jiggins and his friend Peter Theobald got closer, they could see 2 men in the driver and passenger seats. Thinking the men were asleep, they went to inspect and found the 2 men, and a third in the back seat, all dead. The 2 men called police, who arrived shortly to seal off the crime scene and preserve evidence. Detective Superintendent Ivan Dibley was soon on the scene, and the task of identifying the 3 men was the top priority. Each of the victims had been shot twice in the head with what appeared to be a 3-round pump-action 12-bore shotgun. The passenger had suffered a particularly brutal shot to the side of the face, while the passenger had received a direct hit to the back of the head, which obliterated the lower half of his face. The passenger was soon identified as 38-year-old Tony Tucker, while the other 2 were found to be 26-year-old Craig Rolfe in the driver's seat and 37-year-old Pat Tate in the back seat, who had suffered a shot to the stomach before being hit twice in the head. Police knew each of the victims as local hardmen and small-time gangsters. All 3 were known drug dealers with criminal records, who used their physical strength to intimidate and cause fear to their enemies. And these men had many enemies in their line of work. For all intents and purposes, it appeared to be a gangland reprisal. Det Superintendent Dibley said, "This is not an ordinary murder. It looks as if they were enticed down there. As far as murders go, you don't get any more serious than this." The killer fired off 8 rounds, leaving the spent cartridges where they fell, possibly because it was too dark to retrieve them. It is possible the killings had been a professional hit, because 2 of the victims died within 2 seconds, while the third, the backseat passenger Pat Tate, had possibly witnessed what happened to his 2 companions and attempted to escape, but was killed soon afterwards. After the murders were announced in the press, there was little outpouring of grief, except from the families and friends of the deceased, with many suggesting the 3 men had gotten what they deserved. Professional boxer Nigel Benn said of his death, "I have known him since I came out of the army. It is very tragic." D.S. Dibley said, "The public aren't too happy either about so much time being spent on such lowlife. But my job isn't to moralize. The killers have to be caught. There has been no tit for tat yet, and it has surprised me a little." None the families of the dead men cooperated with police inquiries, and Dibley believed they had a good idea who committed the murders, but were scared. The number of suspects in the Rettendon murders, which the murders of Tony Tucker and his associates became known, is long and varied. Owing to the animosity towards the 3 men, the lead detective said, "This was not a whodunit, but a whodidn't." One line of inquiry concerned the death of Leah Betts, and whether or not the murders had been retribution for the death of the teenager. One arrest was made, that of a 27-year-old decorator from South London, who was held during a joint operation with Scotland Yard and charged with firearms offences. D.S. Dibley said, "I'm happy with how our inquiry is proceeding, and I'm hopeful of arrests before I retire. It's how I would want to end a 32-year career." One theory concerned the North London Adams crime family. Essex police received information on January 1, 1996, from a detective from Exeter CID, who phoned in and said he had an underworld contact who believed he knew why the 3 men were killed. The subsequent report said, he has contact with a person who has a good connection with the drugs world in the London and Kent areas. The contact has stated that they were shot because they owe the firm £60,000 pounds. The document added, he has lots of phone inquiries in hand, which say can be connected with our murder inquiry. The man, who was 36 at the time, was described as a doorman/bodybuilder type and an associate of the Adams crime family. It wasn't until May 1996 that a break was made in the case. 3 men were arrested during a police and customs drugs operation. 52-year-old Michael Steele, 33-year-old Jack Hooms, and a third man were arrested and held on suspicion of importing drugs. Through dedicated police work, a link was made between the 3 men and the murders of the Essex boys. Facing a murder charge, the third man, convicted fraudster Darren Nichols, began confessing to police his role in the murders. He claimed to have met Steele, Hooms and Tate a few years earlier while serving a prison sentence for distributing counterfeit currency at Hollesley Bay Prison in Suffolk. Upon his release, Nichols joined Steele's smuggling organization, making trips to Amsterdam. While there, Nichols purchased hundreds of kilos of cannabis on behalf of Steele and Hooms, which he then drove to the Belgian coast. From there he would meet up with Steele's speedboat, and the drugs were then taken across the channel and deposited on the Essex coast, where they would be distributed later. The mastermind of this operation, Mick Steele, was described as a sophisticated Essex drug smuggler. He soon became involved with the Essex boys. In November 1995, he supplied a consignment of cannabis with a street value of around £350,000 to Tate, Tucker, and Rolfe. But the quality was so poor that Steele agreed to take back the cannabis and return a deposit of around £70,000. The money was subsequently paid. However, Tate denied getting it and also failed to return 1/3 of the drugs haul. When Steele protested, Tate threatened to shoot him after making him beg on his knees. Animosity had already developed between the 2 men after Steele had started a close relationship with Tate's ex-girlfriend. A furious Tate boasted he would kill the smuggler in revenge, and when Steele heard of the threats and decided to make the first move, on the pretense of making amends, Steele offered Tate a share in a lucrative cocaine deal he was involved in with his friend Jack Hooms. But Steele was secretly plotting the Essex boys' demise. 6 weeks before the murders, Steele contacted Nichols and asked him to get him a gun. He said Jack had a couple, but they didn't want to use those, and so Nichols said he asked a few people but failed to come up with anything. Tate, Tucker, and Rolfe were invited to look at the farmer's field where the alleged drug plane would land. Nichols went on to claim that when Rolfe's Range Rover approached the locked gate at the designated spot, located at the bottom of Workhouse Lane, Steele jumped out to open it. At the same moment, Jack Hooms, who acted as Steele's right-hand man, leaned in with a pump-action shotgun and began blasting the 3 men inside. Mere seconds later, Nichols got a call from Hooms on his mobile asking him to pick the 2 men up. He said it was only when they climbed into the back of his car, spattered in blood, that he realized what had happened. In his testimony, Nichols claimed that during the journey home, Steele had said, "They want fuck with us again." Fearing he would become an accessory to the murders, Nichols continued to sell drugs on Steele's behalf, but decided to come forward with information on the killings after he received threats from Steele. In late 1997, the 2 men went on trial charged with the murders of Tony Tucker, Pat Tate, and Craig Rolfe. On January 20, 1998, the jury at the Old Bailey deliberated the evidence for 4.5 days before returning guilty verdicts for both men. The weight of evidence had been mobile phone records used to corroborate the informant's testimony, the reliability of which were questioned only afterwards. Mick Steele and Jack Hooms were given triple life sentences. Darren Nichols was placed in the Wintest Protection Program, given a new identity along with his family. Even now, Nichols has said he fears revenge for breaking the criminal code and ratting on his friends. Subsequently, a £250,000 price was put on his head. The dark history of the Rettendon murders is forever tied to the Blue Range Rover. But where is the Rettendon Range Rover now? Nearly 3 decades after the Rettendon murders, the infamous Blue Range Rover, where Pat Tate, Tony Tucker, and Craig Rolfe were executed, has resurfaced in the hands of a private collector. According to reports by the Daily Star, the vehicle is now being sold for an astonishing £100,000. Car collector Jake Hurst claims to own the 1988 Range Rover Vogue SE and initially listed it for £15,000, admitting that the vehicle creeps him out and has an unpleasant odor inside. However, he later increased the asking price to £100,000. The vehicle, which was released by police in 1998 and has changed hands multiple times since, is currently listed as off-road, with its last MOT expiring in 2009. Despite the hefty price tag, Some skeptics doubt whether the car is truly the same one from the notorious Essex Boys murders. Hearst insists it is the real deal, claiming he keeps it in a yard with fake plates to prevent theft. Whether authentic or not, the vehicle remains a macabre piece of British crime history. Early in the investigation, London-based gangster Billy Jasper admitted to detectives he was the real killer's getaway driver. When he was arrested for armed robbery, he confessed to Met detectives that he was given £5,000 to drive a hitman, referred to only as Mr. D, to the murder scene. Jasper even gave evidence at the trial, asserting he was the real getaway driver, but was prevented by the judge from giving any names. The real mastermind behind the Rettendon murders was, according to Jasper, money launderer Patsy Bolt Eyes Clark, who laundered money from the infamous Brinks-Mat robbery, carried out in November 1983, during which £26 million worth of gold bullion, diamonds and cash was stolen from a warehouse operated by Brinks-Mat. One of those arrested over the heist was Patsy Clark, who in 1992 was jailed for 6 years for helping to launder £4.2 million of the proceeds from the Brinks-Mat robbery. According to Jasper, it was Clark who ordered the murder of Tony Tucker. Met Police DCI Dave McKelvey said they had the name of a major criminal, said to be behind the murder, the gunman, a credible motive and intelligence linking Tucker and money from the robbery. However, this line of inquiry was never seriously considered by investigators. DCI McKelvey added, they also had the account of a man claiming to be the getaway driver, but chose to dismiss what he said because it did not fit with their theory about whomson steal. Patsy Clark, a former scrap dealer and nightclub owner, was never questioned by police. Case 4. Craig Rolfe, a name synonymous with the infamous Essex Boys gang, remains an intriguing figure of mystery in the annals of British true crime. His life, marred by criminal activities and a violent end, paints a picture of the darker side of Essex's underworld in the mid-1990s. This article delves into the life of Craig Rolfe, exploring his rise in the criminal world and his crucial role in the Essex Boys drug gang. Craig Rolfe's notoriety in the criminal underworld is largely due to his involvement with the Essex Boys drug gang. This gang, known for its ruthless approach and control over the drug trade in Essex, saw Rolfe rise as a significant and important member of the gang. His activities were not limited to drug dealing, but included a range of criminal activities, earning him a reputation as a well-known figure in the Essex criminal underworld. Born in London's Holloway prison, Rolfe's criminal activities extended beyond the drug trade, and he became involved in various criminal acts that served to bolster his reputation. While detailed records of his crimes are limited, it is known that his influence in Essex's criminal underworld was substantial. His dealings often put him in the crosshairs of police attention, yet he always managed to evade significant legal repercussions for most of his criminal career. While much of Craig Rolfe's life was shrouded in the activities of the Essex Boys gang, there was another, more personal side to him. His relationship with Donna Jaggers, his long-term girlfriend, and their child, whom he left behind, reveals a different aspect of Rolfe. Donna Jaggers, who had been in a relationship with Rolfe for 7 years, was the mother of his child, just 6 years old at the time of the murders. Her emotional response to the tragedy, breaking down in tears in front of journalists, highlighted the profound personal loss behind the publicized criminal facade. The current whereabouts of Donna Jaggers are unknown. In her statement to police, Jaggers detailed Rolfe's involvement in drug dealing and weapons transactions, including the acquisition of a machine gun shortly before his death. After the murders, she discovered the gun in a holdall and eventually turned it over to authorities. Beyond her statement, little is publicly known about her life after the events surrounding the case. I am the girlfriend of Craig Rolfe and have known him for 15 years. We first met when I moved to Basildon with my parents. I started going out with Craig when I was 18, but that was quite a casual relationship. In 000088, just after my 19th birthday, we started a serious relationship, and soon after that I moved in with his parents at Basildon. I fell pregnant, and in 001289, I gave birth to our daughter Georgie. We had moved into a hostel, and were then given 105 spurriers laid on. During this time Craig was working on building sites doing dry lining. We then moved to 21 Bardfield, Vange, but I cannot be sure of dates or when this was. In 000394 Craig bought 8, Calshot Avenue, Chafford 100 Grays. The house at Bardfield was in my name, and I managed to swap this house through the council for my current address. The neighbors at Bardfield were very nosy, and I wanted to avoid problems due to the fact that I only went back there once a week to collect mail, etc. I took my current address with a view to buying it and then renting it out. My relationship with Craig was strong. He trusted me and told me most things that he was up to. In 000595, I had had enough of the drugs. He was using them himself and involved with them in dealing. I moved out of the Calshots address and went to my current address. After about 3 weeks, Craig came back and told me that he was going to make an effort to kick his drug habit. I knew instinctively that he meant this, and we went away on holiday to the Norfolk Broads for a week. When we came back, he had one lapse but stuck to it. Most weekends Craig used to go out, and I knew that he took smaller amounts of cocaine and used ecstasy, but not on the scale that he had been. I was aware that Craig's associates were Tony Tucker and Patrick Tate. During the mid to end of 001195, I was aware that they had something going on which, at this time, I am not willing to discuss. Craig told me that he was going to pick up a machine gun with a silencer and ammunition for their business. He told me that it was coming from a man I know as Mad Mick, who comes from London. I do know that this person is Mick Bowman. I asked Craig how much the gun was going to cost, and he told me that it was being borrowed and was going back to Bowman. About a week after Tony's birthday, which was 171,100, I went with Craig and others, who I do not want to name, to Hollywood's nightclub in Romford. Bowman was supposed to have met us in the Global Net Cafe beforehand, but he didn't turn up. I then met him through Craig in the nightclub. I recall thinking that he wasn't what I had expected. Craig had told me stories about him. He was with a girl who I only know as Debbie. About a week after this, I can be no more precise than this, Craig told me that we were going to meet Mick at the Thurrock Services to collect the gun. I went with Craig in the blue Range Rover, F424NP, to the services, and had something to eat in the Granada premises. I knew that we were supposed to meet Bowman about 1,300 hours, but he was about 10 minutes late. Craig went outside and returned shortly, and told me I was to go outside with them. When I got outside, I saw that Bowman was there with a white VW Corrado car, and there was another male with an old green Vauxhall Cavalier. Bowman was acting very paranoid, and I took it that he was on cocaine, and was acting hyper because of the situation with the gun. I am aware how people behave when they have taken cocaine, and that is how Bowman appeared to me. Bowman was trying to organize how they should drive off to a different location. Craig then suggested we should lead. The Cavalier should go in the middle, and then Bowman at the end. This only took a matter of minutes. Craig and I then got into the Range Rover and drove onto the A13 and traveled along to the Five Bells roundabout. We then came all the way around the Five Bells roundabout, and Craig pulled up onto the Eastern Garage's parking area. The Cavalier parked behind us, and Bowman parked the Coracle behind that. We all got out, and I started to walk away to stay out of the way. I saw a blue/gray holdall come out of the boot of the Cavalier and go into the boot of the Range Rover. The driver of the Cavalier was a small man about 5 feet 6 inches tall, early 20s or early 30s, of thin build. He had short cropped hair and wore glasses. I did not hear him speak. I am unable to say who took the holdall out of the Cavalier, but I believe Craig would probably have put it in the Range Rover, because he was impatient like that. Craig called me back to the car, and I got into the front of the Range Rover. I recall Bowman got into the back of the car and told Craig that he wanted the Range Rover once Craig had finished with it. Bowman then got out of the car, and Craig and I drove off, and went to Patrick Tate's bungalow in Gordon Road, Basildon. Craig had told me that Tate had spoken with the garage proprietor at Eastern Garages, a man called Barry Dorman, and told him that he had to buy Bowman's Corrado. I was aware that Bowman was going to stay behind at the garage and speak to Dorman about this. I recall seeing the two men walking towards one another when I was in the Range Rover. When we arrived outside Pat's house, Pat and Tony Tucker were sitting in Anna Whitehead's, Tucker's girlfriend, Suzuki Vitara. I cannot remember if Craig had spoken to them on his mobile phone prior to arriving at the house. Tony and Pat got out of the Vitara, and Craig took the holdall and gun from the boot, and all three went into the house. Sarah Saunders was at this time moving her stuff out of the house with the help of two friends. I didn't want to get involved in what was potentially a difficult situation, so I stayed in the car. Craig was in the house for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then returned to the car with the holdall and gun. He put the items back in the boot, and then drove to 108 Mill Green, where the gun and holdall were put into the loft. On the way from Gordon Road, Craig was saying how pleased they were with it, and how much damage it could cause. I did not see the gun at this time. A couple of days later, Craig picked me up from work and told me that Tony, Pat, and him had tested the gun. He stated that it was tested over at Tony's fobbing address in the field. He told me that he had cleaned it all and that he had put it back in the loft. He told me that he had cleaned his fingerprints off the gun, as I was concerned about this. The next thing that happened was that Craig, Tony, and Pat were found shot dead. I had a lot of things on my mind, but I realized the machine gun was a problem, but I knew the police didn't know about the Mill Green address, and I thought it would be safe to leave it here. During the Christmas period of 000095, Craig's brother moved my belongings from Chafford 100 to the Mill Green address. First thing after New Year 000096, I moved into Mill Green. I had only been in the house for a couple of days when I decided that I was going to have to do something about the gun. I spoke to Craig's mom about it, and she suggested that I took it round to her house. She was trying to get me to sort it out. I put the hold all on the dining room table, and I opened the bag. Until this point, I had not seen the gun. It was a dull silvery gray color. I only opened the top of the bag and did not see the silencer or ammunition. However, I believed they were in there because Craig had told me. I was now in a position where I had to make a decision as to what I was going to do about it. I left the gun in the bag and left it with Craig's mother. A couple of days later, I contacted D.I. Florence, who came to see me the next day. I only told him that I wanted to see him, but didn't tell him what it was about. About 11:45 on Thursday, 110196, D.I. Florence came to see me at Mill Green, and I told him about the gun at Craig's mother's house. I then took Mr. Florence to 158 Beam Bridge, Basildon, where I saw Craig's mother. I asked her where she had put the hold all. I then went to the shower room, which is on the ground floor, and put the hold all on the dining table for Mr. Florence to see. He asked if any of us had touched it, and he took it into his possession. At this time, this is all I can say about the gun. Referring back to the VW Corrado, I am aware that from talking to Craig that the vehicle was purchased by Eastern Garages, and I believe Bowman was given about £7,000. Craig told me that Bowman had paid about £10,000 for it. A pivotal aspect of Craig Rolfe's criminal life was his association with Tony Tucker and Pat Tate, fellow members of the Essex Boys gang. This trio formed a formidable and dangerous force in the underworld, with their names often mentioned together in hushed tones on the streets of Essex. Their partnership was not just professional, but also deeply personal, bound by a shared ambition and a ruthless approach to their criminal enterprises. He acted as a driver for his boss Tony Tucker, and was, according to his neighbors, a keen motorist who always had different cars on his drive as though he was a car dealer. There were rumors that he was involved with stealing cars and selling drugs, one said. One time I saw the police literally dismantling a car on his drive. According to neighbors, they had little contact with Rolfe and his family, who seemed quite secretive. They were rarely seen, one resident said. It was through his addiction to drugs that Rolfe became acquainted with the other Essex boys, who were heavily involved in dealing drugs. The Rettendon murders, a term that intrigues anyone familiar with Essex's criminal history, refer to the brutal killing of Craig Rolfe, Tony Tucker, and Pat Tate on December 6, 1995. This heinous crime occurred on a quiet country lane in Rettendon, marking a turning point in the history of organized crime in the area. The three men, well-known members of the Essex Boys gang, were found dead inside a Range Rover. The victims of a cold-blooded execution-style killing, each had been blasted by a shotgun at close range. Detectives believe the killer fired off 8 rounds and left the spent cartridges where they fell, with no desire to retrieve them. The 3 shots were fired off in quick succession, hitting Rolfe first, then Tucker. It was surmised that before he could react, Tate was shot in the abdomen. The gunman then reloaded the shotgun, before shooting him twice in the head, and for good measure then fired another shot each into the already dead Tucker and Rolfe. Craig Rolfe had been taken by surprise, as both his hands were still on the steering wheel and his foot still pressed on the brake. There was a 2-inch round entry wound behind his ear that exited out through his mouth, and blood seeped out of the car. Detective Superintendent Ivan Dibley, who was leading the Rettendon murder investigation, believed Tate was the target. The others were merely collateral damage. The gruesome discovery of their bodies was made the following morning by local farmers, who found their blood-spattered Range Rover. The sight of the lifeless victims, slumped inside the vehicle, sent shockwaves through the community, and saw the start of one of the most extensive murder investigations in Essex's history. A newspaper article covering Craig Rolfe made mention of the funeral of drug baron Craig Rolfe, shot dead in a gangland ambush at Rettendon, was held yesterday. A cortege of 20 cars followed a horse-drawn carriage carrying the coffin from his mother's house in Beambridge, Pitsea, to St. Gabriel's and on to the cemetery. Mourners heard the Rev. Laurie Blaney say words by Rolf's partner Donna Jaggers, 26, and his mother Lorraine. Rolf, 26, of Chafford Hundred, was shot in a Range Rover on a remote track on December 6. The funerals of Patrick Tate, 37, of Gordon Road, Basildon, and Anthony Tucker, 38, of Fobbing, murdered with him, were taking place today. Several theories have surfaced regarding the motive behind these murders. Some suggest their deaths were related to the drug underworld in which they operated, others point to internal gang rivalries, and a few even link the killings to the death of Leah Betts, a young girl who died after taking an ecstasy tablet rumored to have been supplied by the Essex Boys. Despite extensive speculation, the true motive behind these murders remains a subject of debate and mystery. The investigation into the Rettendon murders was both complex and extensive, involving numerous police resources. In January 1998, after more than 2 years of working the case, police arrested Jack Hooms and Michael Steele, who were later convicted for the 3 murders. This conviction was largely based on the testimony of police informant Darren Nichols, who was a former associate of the accused. Operation Century, conducted by Essex Police with assistance from the Royal Ulster Constabulary Special Branch, RUC, was a high-stakes sting operation focused on the infamous Rettendon murders involving Craig Rolfe and 2 other members of the Essex Boys gang. Initiated in response to these brutal killings in December 1995, this operation sought to apply pressure on individuals suspected of having knowledge about the murders, in an effort to gather evidence and incriminate the culprits. Tactics and controversies. The operation, however, was marred by controversies and questionable tactics. Essex Police, under the pretext of the renewed Irish Republican bombing campaign, including the 1996 Docklands bombing, employed intimidating and threatening strategies. Undercover officers made harassing phone calls to the suspects and their families, posing as Republican drug runners from Belfast. These calls involved foul language and threats, which in some cases could be construed as death threats. One particularly affected individual was Donna Jaggers, the girlfriend of Craig Rolfe, who was misled to believe that these terror tactics were being employed by Belfast-based Republicans. She turned to Essex Police for assistance, unaware that the police themselves were behind these calls. The impact of these tactics on Jaggers and other victims, already grieving and distraught, was profound and deeply criticized. The methods used in Operation Century were eventually deemed illegal and counterproductive. During the trial for the Rettendon murders, tape recordings of the threatening police phone calls were presented in court, revealing the increasing threats as the operation unraveled. The suspects did not believe the undercover officers' claims of Belfast Republicans funding Essex criminal activities, leading to the operation's failure. This operation drew significant media attention and criticism, particularly for its senior officer, Detective Superintendent Ivan Dibley. Comparisons were made to a previous controversial undercover operation, Operation Edsel, which involved the Rachel Nichol murder case. The tactics used in Operation Century, like those in Edsel, were criticized for their ethical breaches and inefficacy. Operation Century remains a contentious chapter in the investigation of the Rettendon murders, illustrating the complexities and ethical challenges faced in high-profile criminal investigations. The operation's tactics, though intended to solve a heinous crime, crossed legal and ethical boundaries, affecting the lives of those connected to the case and stirring debate within law enforcement and the public. Hooms and Steele were sentenced to life imprisonment after a trial at the Old Bailey. However, the reliability of the evidence, particularly mobile phone records used to corroborate the informant's testimony, was called into question. Over the next 2 decades, both men challenged their convictions, albeit unsuccessfully. In a significant development, Jack Hooms was released from prison on license in January 2021 after serving 23 years. His sentence was reduced by 2 years in 2018 due to his exemplary conduct while incarcerated. Craig Rolfe's legacy extends beyond his life and the infamous Rettendon murders. His story has inspired several crime dramas and documentaries, reflecting the enduring fascination with the Essex Boys saga. Films like Essex Boys, 2000, Rise of the Foot Soldier, 2007, and Bonded by Blood, 2010, draw inspiration from the events surrounding Rolfe and his associates. These portrayals have kept the memory of the Rettendon murders alive in popular culture, illustrating the ongoing interest in this dark chapter of Essex's history. Craig Rolfe's journey from an obscure figure in Essex to a central character in one of the most notorious crime stories in British history is both compelling and cautionary. His life, marked by criminal exploits and a tragic end, offers a glimpse into the complexities of the criminal underworld. The Rettendon murders, his involvement in the Essex Boys gang, and the impact on his family and community continue to fascinate and horrify in equal measure. Case 5. On November 11, 1995, a young woman named Leah Betts was admitted to hospital for a suspected drug overdose. That evening she had been out celebrating her 18th birthday with friends at an Essex nightclub, where it was alleged she had taken an ecstasy tablet. 5 days later, Leah Betts died from the effects of the drug, which was used by the British tabloid media as an example of the dangers of drugs. For many young people turning 18, a night out drinking and partying is seen as a rite of passage, that final journey from childhood to adulthood. From that point onwards, they can legally buy items and do things that were once forbidden. For Leah Betts, it was meant to be a happy event, but her celebrations soon turned tragic. Just 10 days after her 18th birthday, Leah Betts, a schoolgirl from Latchington in Essex, decided to go partying with friends at one of the many nightclubs in the area. At some point in the evening, the group of friends went to Raquel's club, where one of them bought a bag of ecstasy, MDMA, tablets from a dealer that were stamped with an apple symbol. It is unknown who provided a tablet to Leah Betts, but 4 hours after taking one, and after drinking approximately 7 liters of water during a 90-minute period. This was following common advice at the time to drink more fluids after taking an excessive dancing post-drug that could lead to dehydration, which in turn exacerbating her hyponatremia, a symptom known as SIADH. As a result, Leah began drinking an unsafe amount of water. With the drug affecting her bodily systems, she felt unwell and was taken to Broomfield Hospital in Chelmsford, where she would remain until she died, just 5 days later when the life support machine keeping her alive was turned off. This decision was taken by her family, who were told she would not recover from the effects of the drugs she ingested. A post-mortem found that because of the drug's effects of her bodily functions, she was unable to relieve herself after drinking so much water. As a result, she suffered water intoxication and hyponatremia, which led to her brain swelling. This is what caused her to fall into a coma, from which she never recovered. Sat at her bedside was her father Paul Betts, an ex-policeman, her stepmother and her brother William, who was 7 years younger. Look what can happen when young people don't listen. One tablet could end her life. What sort of a buzz is that, for God's sake? She's 18, said Paul. I don't know whether she is going to see 19. At the inquest, it was stated by toxicologist John Henry, who had previously warned the public of the danger of MDMA causing death by dehydration. If Leah had taken the drug alone, she might well have survived. If she had drunk the amount of water alone, she would have survived. The death of Leah Betts was a direct result of the ecstasy, MDMA, tablet she was supplied and had taken, and so Essex police launched a large inquiry to locate the suppliers of the tablet she had taken. A team of 35 officers were able to pinpoint Raquel's club as the venue where it was bought. Detectives arrested and charged 4 of her friends who had been present at the house as a result of the investigation. Of these 4, only 2 were prosecuted. 1 received a conditional discharge, while the other was acquitted after a retrial. The identity of the dealer remained a mystery, as did the group behind the supply of drugs, with the whole investigation cost roughly £300,000. The death of Leah Betts caused fear and shock across Britain, with many parents worried about dangers such drugs posed to their children. Leah was a young woman from a middle-class family, who, it was believed, had never done drugs before. The British press used the incident as a prime example of the dangers of drug use. Every so often an event occurs which shocks us out of our apathy. The tragedy of Leah Betts is such an event, Liverpool Echo journalist Walter Huntley said at the time. Police confirmed that the drug Leah had taken was not contaminated, and that she had died from the effects of the drug on its own. 1 month after the tragic death of Leah Betts, the bodies of 3 men were found inside a Range Rover on a quiet country lane in Rettendon. The victims, who had been shot to death inside the vehicle, were later identified as local drug dealers Tony Tucker, Pat Tate and Craig Rolfe, who were known as the Essex Boys. It soon became reported in the press that Tucker's gang had been responsible for the control of drugs in Raquel's club, the Basildon nightclub where the ecstasy tablet that caused Leah Betts' death had been bought. This in turn led to the theory that the murders of the Essex boys was in retaliation for her death. The father of Leah Betts, a retired Met firearms officer, was even pulled in for questioning over the shootings. Paul Betts said, "I nearly got nicked for the murders. At the time I was running a clay pigeon shooting business, and the police took all my guns. But I hadn't heard of any of the murdered three." Despite this theory, there was never any evidence that linked the three murdered drug dealers to the supply of drugs that caused Leah Betts' death. The murder of the Essex boys was later attributed to an underworld feud that caused a fallout between Tony Tucker, Pat Tate, and Craig Rolfe, and two associates who were later convicted of their murders. An anti-drug campaign featured a picture of Leah Betts smiling, with the caption sorted, "Just one ecstasy tablet took Leah Betts." A haunting image of Leah Betts on life support in her hospital bed that was released by her family has become one of the defining images of the dangers of drug use in Britain. Case 6. Many people throughout the world enjoy following their favorite celebrities, with some even wishing they could meet them someday. Then there are people who hold more than just a passing interest and would want to pursue a relationship. One of those people believed she had fulfilled this dream when she entered into a relationship, a Hollywood actor. Sadly, it turned out that unscrupulous scammers had deceived the poor woman out of $850,000 with a Brad Pitt scam. Online scammers have been around for as long as the internet itself. They pose as someone in need, hoping their victim will send them money. Romance scams are even more insidious when they prey on the lonely and desperate. In the U.S. alone, more than 64,000 Americans were scammed out of a total of over $1 billion in 2023. This was double the $500 million just 4 years earlier. On January 12, 2025, French broadcaster TF1 aired a program about a woman who reportedly believed she had been in a committed relationship with Hollywood actor Brad Pitt for a year and a half. When the story attracted national attention, the broadcaster withdrew it after the victim began receiving mockery from online social media posters. The 7 to 8 program gave details about the scam, in which the victim, 53-year-old interior designer Anne, had lost her life savings and tried to take her own life 3 times since the scam came to light. TF1 announced it had removed the show on, and after her testimony had sparked a wave of harassment. Despite its removal, the program can still be found online. Further mockery came from Netflix France, who put out a post on X advertising for films with Brad Pitt for real. The post was later deleted, while French football club Toulouse FC made a formal apology to, and after it said, "Hi Anne, Brad told us he would be at the stadium on Wednesday, and you?" It was explained in the program that Anne was first contacted by someone when she downloaded Instagram in February 2023. At that time, she was still in a marriage to a wealthy entrepreneur. The individual who made contact claimed to be Brad Pitt's mother, Jane Etta, who told Anne her son needed a woman just like her. The next day, someone claiming to be Pitt messaged Anne, which immediately made her suspicious. "At first I said to myself that it was fake, that it's ridiculous, but as someone who isn't very used to social media, I didn't really know what was happening to me," she said. The two began a lengthy correspondence, and at one point, the person claiming to be Brad Pitt said he tried to send her luxury gifts. He then went on to explain that he was unable to pay customs on them, as his bank accounts were frozen. This was due, he said, to the divorce proceedings with actress Angelina Jolie, and promptly transferred €9,000 to the scammers. "Like a fool, I paid. Every time I doubted him, he managed to dissipate my doubts," she said. The request for more money continued, and the pressure was increased when the fake Pitt said he needed money to pay for kidney cancer treatment. In an effort to convince her, the scammer sent multiple pictures depicting the 61-year-old actor in a hospital bed, with bandages wrapped around his head, and even one of him on the operating table. Unbeknownst to Anne, these were AI-generated images. However, when she tried to confirm if they were real, she found nothing that made her suspicious. "I looked those photos up on the internet, but couldn't find them, so I thought that meant he had taken those selfies just for me," she said. Around this time, Anne and her husband divorced, and she was awarded €775,000 as her share of the proceeds of their assets. Every euro of this money would eventually be sent to the scammers. Anne, whose own cancer is in remission, believed she was helping Pitt by sending him more and more money. "I told myself I was maybe saving a man's life." Anne's own daughter, aged 22, told the TF1 program that she knew what her mother was doing and tried to get her mother to see reason for the better part of a year. However, Her mother was excited about her celebrity relationship. It hurt to see how naive she was being, she said. In early 2024, gossip magazines began reporting that Pitt was in a new relationship. This made her suspicious. However, scammers were one step ahead and sent her a fake news report in which an AI-generated news anchor talked about Pitt being in an exclusive relationship with one special individual, who goes by the name of Anne. This settled Anne's suspicions for a time. However, on July 4, 2024, it was revealed by People magazine that Brad Pitt was in a relationship with Ines de Ramon, and that things between them were serious. With this, Anne decided to end things with the fake Pitt. By September 2024, a source said that Pitt is very committed to de Ramon. In an effort to get more money from Anne, the scammers attempted to contact her again, this time posing as Special FBI Agent John Smith. However, Anne contacted the police, which prompted an investigation. In total, the scammers had taken $850,000 from Anne. The TF1 program said that Anne had been left broke after the scam, and that she attempted to take her own life on 3 separate occasions, and revealed she was now living with a friend, saying, "My whole life is a small room with some boxes. That's all I have left." Although she was taken in by the scam, she said that anyone could have fallen for the it if they were told words that you never heard from your own husband, adding, "Why was I chosen to be hurt this way? These people deserve hell," a tearful Anne said. "We need to find those scammers. I beg you, please help me find them." When the program aired, Anne hit back at online mockery, explaining in a YouTube interview that TF1 had left out details about her repeated doubts over whether she was talking to the real Brad Pitt. Despite the online backlash and ridicule, some have gone on to support Anne, with one person saying, "I understand the comic effect, but we're talking about a woman in her 50s who got conned by deepfakes and AI, which your parents and grandparents would be incapable to spot." Romance scams can affect anyone, at any age, and thousands of people are conned every year. For many, the advent of AI will seemingly only worsen the situation, with talented artists capable of creating convincing images that appear genuine, coupled with plausible scams, meaning people are at risk of being fooled more easily. French newspaper Libération said, "Life today is paved with cyber traps, and AI progress will only worsen this scenario." Case 7. When serial killer, cannibal, and necrophile Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested for the murders of 16 young men in Wisconsin, and one in Ohio during the late 1980s and early 1990s, he made a confession to the many bizarre and horrific things he did to his victims. The culmination of his crimes would have been the creation of Jeffrey Dahmer's altar, a shrine to those he had murdered. On July 22, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer, a 31-year-old unemployed Milwaukee chocolate factory worker, was arrested by police after a young black man reported having escaped his Oxford apartment where he had been handcuffed and threatened with rape and murder. When officers went to Dahmer's apartment, they found Polaroid pictures of dismembered bodies. Placed under arrest, Dahmer's apartment was searched and found to contain the remains from the many bodies of young men who had been murdered, dismembered, and portions of their bodies stored in his refrigerator. When this was opened by one policeman, there were the severed heads of 2 men sat on a shelf. In a 57-gallon drum located in the bedroom, 3 bodies were found dissolving in an acid solution, while in a metal stockpot contained the decomposed hands and penis of another victim. Along with the head in the refrigerator, 3 others were stored in the freezer, while another 7 more had been stripped of flesh, painted gray, and kept as trophies. During his interrogations, which began the day after his arrest, he waived his right to have an attorney present and gave detectives a candid confession of the many ghastly and bizarre crimes he had committed since his first murder in 1978. Towards the end of his murder spree, Dahmer was killing at a rate of 1 murder a week. He claimed it was an incessant and never-ending desire to be with someone at whatever cost. Someone good-looking, really nice-looking. It just filled my thoughts all day long. When detectives asked why he kept so many of his victims' skulls, some of which had been painted, others bleached, Dahmer offered up a truly shocking explanation. Dahmer stated he had kept so many of his victims' skulls and other body parts because he was in the process of constructing what he referred to as Jeffrey Dahmer's altar, a private shrine of victims' skulls, which he had intended to display on the black table that was located in his living room, and upon which many of his victims' bodies had been photographed upon. He also admitted to carrying out acts of necrophilia with the bodies and to consuming portions of some victims. When asked why, Dahmer stated, "I suppose, in an odd way, it made me feel they were even more a permanent part of me." After 2 weeks of confessions, Dahmer was charged with 16 counts of first-degree murder. While he was incarcerated awaiting trial, detectives conducted further interviews with Dahmer about his crimes and the strange altar he mentioned in his initial confessions. On November 14, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer provided investigators and his defense attorney Wendy Petricus with a hand-drawn sketch of how he intended his altar to appear. On a piece of paper from a yellow legal pad, the crudely drawn diagram consisted of a large black table, upon which was arranged the many skulls of his victims. This would have included the 4 severed heads found in his kitchen, which would have been stripped of flesh, alongside the skulls he had already collected, and an additional future victim's skull. Incense sticks were to be placed at each end of the black table, above which Dahmer intended to place a large blue lamp with extending blue globe lights. This display of skulls was to be adorned at each side with the fully articulated and painted skeletons of his victims, Ernest Miller and Oliver Lacey. The entire construction was to be placed before a window covered with a blue, opaque shower curtain, in front of which Dahmer intended to sit in a black plush leather chair. Above it all sat a wall plaque, with a drawn image that appeared to represent an animal skull of some type with horns protruding. He saved the entire bodies of these 2 on the end, Petricus said, noting that Dahmer had a thing for hands. He'd saved the hands a lot of times and obviously the penis. She went on to describe how Dahmer had this lamp that had these globes that went over the top of each one of the skulls that he would have to kind of highlight it. And then he would just sit there in his chair, and it was his own little shrine to himself. According to the drawing, one of the skeletons was shown to be in the bathroom, where Dahmer would be removing the flesh from its bones. Towards the end of his killing spree, Dahmer was close to completing the fantasy of having his own altar. During another interview on November 18, 1991, Dahmer was asked to whom the altar would be dedicated to. He replied, "Myself. It was a place where I could feel at home." He further described his intended altar as a place for meditation, from where he believed he could draw a sense of power, adding, "If this, his arrest, had happened 6 months later, that's what they would have found." Dahmer also said, "I could sit in this black chair surrounded by my best friends, and they could never leave me cause they were physically and emotionally part of me. When I could sit in that chair, I would finally feel powerful." One of the most significant explanations he gave for committing his crimes was his fear of abandonment, the fear that his partners would leave him, something he could not tolerate. The control aspect of his crimes was another fundamental and almost all-consuming fantasy that dictated the very nature of his crimes. With the cannibalism of his victims' bodies, devouring their very being, and the experimentation he carried out to perfect his need for a submissive partner, Jeffrey Dahmer had, by his own admission, dabbled with Satanism. He described how just having the bodies of his victims around him made him feel thoroughly evil. One body, that of Tony Hughes, was kept in the bedroom of his apartment even as he had invited another victim over to pose for nude photographs. One thing his surviving victim, and even the police, noticed was the overpowering smell of death in his apartment. "I have to question whether or not there is an evil force in the world, and whether or not I have been influenced by it. Although I am not sure if there is a God," Dahmer said, "or if there is a devil, I know that as of lately I've been doing a lot of thinking about both." It is unknown to what extent Dahmer explored Satanism, but it was evidently not as extreme as the Night Stalker Richard Ramirez's fascination was with the dark arts. However, Jeffrey Dahmer's altar, his shrine to his victims that would take center stage in his apartment, featuring all of his trophies, his statue of a griffin, the incense that burned in the skulls of his victims, was intended to afford him something more supernatural. Dahmer confessed the desire he would receive special powers and energies to help him socially and financially. During his interrogation, Jeffrey Dahmer told detectives that he needed only one more skull to complete the morbid shrine he had planned to his victims. It is unknown if the completion of Jeffrey Dahmer's altar would have prompted him to cease his murderous spree, or if he would continue past his intended victim count. By the time of his arrest, Dahmer had previously lost his position at the Milwaukee Ambrosia Chocolate Factory on July 19, 1991. With his employment terminated, Dahmer would have been forced to look for other work, or face the prospect of losing his tenancy at the Oxford Apartments, meaning he would have likely had to move back in with his grandmother. This was something that was likely to affect Dahmer's plans for his altar. However, his arrest just 5 days after he was fired from his job meant his murders came to an abrupt end, and any further plans he had to create his private altar of death were to forever remain just a dark fantasy of an evil serial killer. Case 8. On June 29, 1973, teenager Rita Jolly left her West Lynn, Oregon home to take a walk alone during the early evening hours. She never returned to her family, although numerous sightings of Jolly were made in the aftermath of her disappearance, but her whereabouts are unknown. There were several suspects investigated by police, including notorious serial killer Ted Bundy. On the evening of June 29, 1973, 17-year-old Rita Jolly decided to take a late-night walk at around 7:15 p.m., something that was normal, which she did often. Rita took no money, extra clothing, or personal effects with her when she left her West Lynn home. The last thing she did was smile to her parents before she walked away. When she failed to return home, her parents and siblings grew worried for her safety, and after waiting in hope that she might return later than planned, they started to think something bad might have happened. They reported her missing to Clackamas County law enforcement, who began a search for the teenager, suspecting she might have stayed with friends. The first assumption was that Rita had run away from home. However, her parents assured police that although their daughter had some personal difficulties growing up, she was happy and content at home. She had no reason to run away, her parents insisted. In the knowledge they were now searching for a potentially vulnerable and underage girl, police set about looking for anyone who might have witnessed Rita Jolly after she left home. Born on December 6, 1955, Rita Lorraine Jolly was the youngest child of Donald and Mary Elizabeth Jolly, who lived in West Lynn, Oregon, where Rita grew up with her two brothers and sister Jill Elaine. A creative personality, Rita enjoyed spending her time after school writing poetry, reading as well as drawing and painting. Rita's parents were passionate about education and actively encouraged their children to pursue their talents, keeping creativity and critical thinking as important priorities in their upbringing. Considered liberal, especially for the time, the Jollies wanted their children to be able to make independent decisions and work their way through problems. Having met at the University of Minnesota, Donald and Mary Elizabeth later opened up a law office together, with Donald pursuing a career as an attorney, worked closely with his wife, who was employed as his legal secretary. Growing up, Rita showed signs of being autistic, however her family never got a diagnosis or any support. Because of this, she struggled from a young age with various things, including regulating her emotions, and was considered a sensitive child. The Jollies decided to reach out to a child psychologist to get some help. However, she continued to struggle at school, and was often bullied by other kids for being considered different. As a result, she found it difficult to make friends, suffered from peer pressure, and found herself trying to catch up to her classmates in lessons. Despite these setbacks and challenges, Rita showed an interest in nature and animals, and immersed herself in reading, writing poetry, and creating art. Rita Jolly was described as a young Caucasian female, 5 feet 6 inches, 130 pounds, with light brown hair, hazel eyes, and was last seen wearing a brown Pendleton shirt, blue jeans or army fatigue pants, and low-cut blue sneakers with buckskin heels. Her parents told detectives Rita had previously fractured her lower left leg, and the injury didn't heal properly, and as a result, she walked with an uneven gait. Some witnesses did come forward to report last seeing Rita at around 8:30 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. in the Robinwood area, or near Sunset Avenue. Another report said Rita was also seen on a main street of Oregon City, near the Oregon City Arch Bridge, at 9:30 p.m. 2 men reported having tried to pick up a girl who looked like Rita. However, the men did not leave their names, and eventually this was proved not to be Rita Jolly. Police strongly suspected foul play was the reason for Rita's disappearance. After exploring all potential avenues, there were no further leads in the case, despite police investigating 5 alleged possible suspects, none of whom were charged with her abduction. In the years since her murder, a popular suspect was put forward who might have been responsible. After receiving 2 death sentences for the murder of Kimberly Leach and the Chi Omega killings, Ted Bundy had been sent to Florida's death, where he continued to protest his innocence in the crimes for which he had been convicted. However, many in law enforcement suspected Bundy was a serial killer who had claimed many more victims. He was a prime suspect in 8 murders in Washington, which included the disappearances of Linda and Healy, Donna Manson, Susan Rancourt, Roberta Parks, Brenda Ball, Georgianne Hawkins, Janice Ott, and Denise Naslund. Bundy was also believed to be responsible for a series of missing women in Utah between 1975 and 1976. These included 5 women, some of whom were found dead and others who vanished and were never seen again, such as Nancy Wilcox, Melissa Smith, Laura Am, Deborah Kent, and Susan Curtis. There were also unsolved crimes in Oregon, Idaho, and Colorado for which investigators wanted to question Bundy. In his confessions shortly before his execution, Ted Bundy told detectives about previously unconfirmed murders he had committed. In his last hours, he admitted to as many as 37 murders, including 2 unidentified murders in Oregon. These were believed to have been the disappearances of Vicki Lynn Holler and Rita Jolly. 24-year-old Holler went missing from Eugene on August 20th, 1973, just under a month before Jolly vanished. However, detectives from Oregon never got the opportunity to question Bundy over the 2 Oregon cases, and his involvement was never ascertained. A third potential Oregon victim was Susan Ray Justice, aged 23, who was last seen in Portland on November 5, 1973. In his interviews with agents from the FBI Behavioral Science Unit, Bundy maintained that he did not begin killing until early 1975. Before that, he stated that he made the progression from a peeping Tom to a stalker to attacking women and then running away, before he finally started to commit home invasions, such as the brutal attack against Karen Sparks, considered to be his first victim and one of the few to survive. Despite insisting that he committed no crimes before 1974, Ted Bundy is a suspect in numerous other crimes, beginning with the 1961 abduction of Marie Burr, who some suspect was his first victim when he was a teenager. Despite the many theories of law enforcement, Bundy's Oregon victims remain unidentified. The Jolly family have received no word on the whereabouts of Rita and never learned what happened to their daughter. Her sister Jill Elaine said, "The truth is that we really don't know what happened to her. We all have theories. Our dad thought she had called several times, mostly just silence on the phone, but once he said that he heard her voice. Mom, Mom, then Dad, then a click on the phone hanging up. Could she have gotten involved in a cult or some other situation where it was hard to leave? I find myself wondering how folks can help with solving the mystery of what happened to Rita. After 50 years, I don't think it's likely that we will have answers before all of us who knew her are gone from this earth. The advent of DNA gave us so much hope, but the number of unidentified bodies and the expense and difficulty of the tests has been discouraging. It's not a quick fix. Nonetheless, perhaps someday she will be one of the humans who are given their name back. After more than 50 years without answers, the Jilly family still holds some measure of hope that one day they'll learn the truth. Case 9. After running away from home, 14-year-old Brenda Baker was last seen getting into a truck after hitchhiking near Puyallup, Washington in May 1974. Several weeks later, remains found at Miller-Sylvania State Park would be positively identified as those of Baker. Long suspected as a possible victim of serial killer Ted Bundy, it is likely Baker fell prey to another dangerous killer. When Brenda Baker, a 14-year-old Washington high school student, failed to return home, her family reported her missing. A rebellious teenager, Baker had run away from home in the weeks before her disappearance, when she left her Maple Valley home a second time, on May 25, 1974. As a runaway, Baker was not considered to be in immediate danger. Her father, Benjamin Baker, could do little but wait for his daughter to return home. One friend told police that Brenda mentioned that she was going to thumb a ride to the U.S. Army base at Fort Lewis, Oregon, where she planned to meet a soldier. Police were able to trace her movements from her Seattle suburb home to Puyallup. Friends said they last saw her near Puyallup, where she was hitchhiking. She was described as 5 feet 2 inches, 165 pounds, with brown eyes, brown hair, and wearing brown horn-rimmed glasses, and dressed in a tan, hip-length corduroy jacket, red blouse, red stretch knit pants, brown leather shoes, and white socks. While her family worried for her safety, police received a break in the case. On June 17th, several weeks after Brenda Baker was last seen, the body of a young woman was found in what was described as an inaccessible part of Miller-Sylvania State Park. A property owner, Tom Ismay, along with 2 female companions, made the discovery of the partially clothed, decomposed body, which had been reportedly hidden beneath 2 wooden logs. The cause of death could not be immediately determined due to the advanced state of decomposition of the remains. A preliminary autopsy was conducted by Tacoma pathologist Dr. Charles Larson, who, along with 2 assistants, determined the victim's age to be roughly between 28 and 34 years. Another, more extensive examination was conducted by Dr. William Veach, an Olympia radiologist, who used X-rays to determine the age of the victim as that of a younger woman aged 14 to 19. This age discrepancy caused initial confusion to investigators. The Thurston County Sheriff's Office had recovered several personal items from the body, which included 2 bracelets, a set of earrings and a ring, which they hoped would help identify the remains. Police then began a search of missing persons, focusing on those anywhere from ages 12 to 50. Efforts to identify the remains began almost immediately, and dental impressions were taken, along with fingerprints. Over the next 48 hours, Undersheriff Jack Crawford trawled through missing person reports when he came across a runaway report of Brenda Baker, who was reported as missing by her family. While Crawford waited for the dental records, he contacted the Baker family and asked them about personal affects Brenda had when she went missing. A description of the clothing found on the body seemed a match to what Brenda Baker had been wearing when she ran away from home. Her father was invited to view the clothing and personal affects, such as the jewelry found on the body. Crawford later said of the identification process was like the spoke on a wheel. All the clues we had seemed to lead back to one hub, and that hub was Brenda Joy Baker. Benjamin Baker positively identified the clothing and the ornamental jewelry, while the dental records returned as a match. Thurston County Coroner Hollis Foltz released the body to the Baker family, but gave no official cause of death. Along with her father, Baker had 2 older sisters and a brother who was in the military. Crawford said the Kings County report had been the second complaint against Baker, after she was previously apprehended by Olympia police during the previous incident. Concerning the investigation, Crawford said Thurston County Sheriff's detectives had traveled to Seattle in an attempt to retrace Brenda's trail. He added, "We have a lot of people to talk to, and that the department had several leads to investigate, but they would continue to pursue any and all tips." Police knew Brenda was last seen hitchhiking south, about 4 blocks from her Maple Valley home. Witnesses then came forward to report seeing a young girl matching Brenda Baker's description, getting into a vehicle on May 27, 1974. Thurston County Sheriff Don Redmond said he was seeking the identity of 2 male occupants of a blue pickup seen southbound from Puyallup. The pickup reportedly carried Brenda Baker, who was seen at around 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. Police refused to comment on whether Baker's death was attributed to hitchhiking. Thurston County Coroner Hollis Foltz later ruled Baker's death a homicide, with the cause of death listed as strangulation or knife wounds, and that she had been dead for 2 to 3 weeks prior to the discovery. For some detectives, they saw a similarity between Brenda Baker's death and the murder of Catherine Devine, another 14-year-old who was abducted on November 25, 1973, and whose body was found the following month in McKinney State Park in the Capitol State Forest near Olympia, Washington. The Ingram High School student had been sodomized and strangled. Devine had also hitchhiked out of the Seattle area. However, a spokesman for the department said there was no evidence of any connection between the 2 cases. Thurston County detectives were also investigating the disappearance of Donna Manson, who vanished from Evergreen State College on March 12, 1974. Other cases involving missing college-aged women were also being investigated by Washington authorities, including the January 1974 disappearance of Linda and Healy, Susan Rancourt, who went missing from Central Washington State College on April 17, and Oregon State University student Roberta Parks, who had been missing since May 6. All of these women were reported to have disappeared under suspicious circumstances. However, detectives had no major leads in any of the cases. For some investigators, there was the theory that these missing person cases were possibly connected to a single perpetrator. An unknown man had been reportedly seen in the vicinity of the Rancourt disappearance, with his arm in a sling asking for assistance from students. In early 1975, an anonymous person called the Thurston County Sheriff's Department to report witnessing what he described as a suspicious male occupying a secluded shack on the Black River at roughly the same times that corresponded with the murders of Catherine Devine and Brenda Baker. The caller explained he had been grouse hunting in late November when he stumbled across the man. This occurred in the area of the Black River, where he came across an old shack and saw a male and 2 young girls, aged about 12 or 14. The caller then went on to explain that he returned to the shack in January 1975, but found it abandoned. Nearby, he found the scattered remains, those of 6 dog and 1 cat carcass, all of which had been skinned and the bones removed. Over the course of 3 weeks, the shack remained vacant, until the caller said he returned and saw someone he thought might be the same individual. The caller and a friend then returned again and reported they were fired upon. The unknown caller told police that the time when the man was at the shack and when the two homicides were discovered were around the same time. A second witness came forward to tell investigators he saw a young woman matching Brenda Baker's description was seen hitchhiking near the Scott Lake interchange on Interstate 5 in May 1974. Bill Sullivan told detectives he and his wife stopped at a truck stop at the Scott Lake interchange on either May 10th or 11th. There, they saw a girl who may have been Brenda Baker hitchhiking, and said the girl got into an older model light-colored panel truck that was being driven by a bearded man. Sullivan said the truck came from the direction of Scott Lake. Baker was not reported missing from her Seattle home until May 25, 1974. By August 1975, a suspect had been arrested in connection with numerous Washington disappearances. Ted Bundy, at that time a Utah law student, was suspected of involvement in the attempted abduction of Carol Duranch, who had been approached by a man pretending to be a police officer, and who proceeded to kidnap Duranch, who barely escaped the encounter. Investigators also suspected Bundy in the abduction and murder of Karen Campbell, who had been taken from the Snowmass ski resort in Colorado. Her naked and battered body was found weeks later. A subsequent search of Bundy's Volkswagen Beetle uncovered hair samples that were connected to Campbell and 3 other young women who had been reported missing. Many investigators suspected Ted Bundy had committed many murders in Washington, Utah, and Colorado, with some estimating as many as a dozen or so victims. In June 1976, Bundy was found guilty and of the attempted kidnapping of Carol Duranch and sentenced to between 1 and 15 years. He was then extradited to Colorado to face charges over the murder of Karen Campbell. During his incarceration, Bundy escaped twice. During his second escape, he successfully traveled to Florida and there perpetrated the murders of 2 college students at the Chi Omega sorority house, wounding 3 others, and later the murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. Not long after these crimes, Bundy, who had been added to the FBI Most Wanted list, was recaptured. Charged with these 3 murders, Bundy was found guilty and sentenced to death during 2 separate trials. Although he continued to claim his innocence, Bundy was suspected in the murders of another 20 young women who had disappeared between 1973 and 1975. One of those was Brenda Baker, whose murder occurred during similar disappearances in Washington. During his death row confessions that took place shortly before his execution in January 1989, Ted Bundy was asked about his involvement in the murders of both Catherine Devine and Brenda Baker. Although he confessed to several unsolved murders, Bundy denied any knowledge of the 2 cases, refusing to admit his involvement. In 1986, Thurston County detectives interviewed a suspect in prison about his possible involvement in the murder of Catherine Devine. William Cosden, Jr., who was serving a 32-year-old sentence for the 1975 rape of Beverly Pearson, a Thurston County resident, denied having anything to do with Devine's death. Cosden, who was a 26-year-old Vietnam vet at the time of Devine's murder, had resided with his family on Lake Scott. He had been released from a mental institution in 1973, following the 1967 sexual assault and murder of a young woman in Maryland. Cosden had been deemed as no longer be a threat to society. Without any firm evidence of his involvement, Cosden could not be linked to the murder of Catherine Devine. On March 7, 2002, the Thurston County Sheriff's Office announced that they finally solved the murder of Kathy Devine. By using DNA collection from the original crime scene, investigators were able to determine that William Cosden, Jr. was the killer of Catherine Devine. His DNA was matched to a vaginal swab taken from Devine during her autopsy. Presented with the evidence, Cosden eventually admitted to having sex with the teenager, but denied her murder. At the time her case was solved, the murder of Catherine Devine was the oldest open murder case in the history of Washington state to have been solved through the use of DNA fingerprinting. For the family of Brenda Baker and the detectives who worked her case, Cosden's conviction for the Devine murder brought renewed hope that her killer would be caught. There were strong suspicions that Cosden had committed both the Devine and Baker murders. However, without evidence linking him to the crime, the case would remain cold. Baker's sister, Charlene, revealed that detectives who worked Brenda's case suspected Cosden was responsible, not Ted Bundy. But for the Baker family, there was little faith her murder would be solved, primarily because investigators had failed to take any DNA samples from the crime scene, and so have nothing to compare to a potential suspect. Although Ted Bundy is often considered a strong suspect in the murder of Brenda Baker, and the fact he had committed similar abductions and murder around the same time, for the family of Baker and Thurston County authorities, the prime suspect in the case is William Cosden Jr., who has himself denied any involvement. The murder of Brenda Baker remains officially unsolved. Case 10. On a summer day in July 1974, when many people visited Lake Sammamish State Park in Washington, two young women went missing after talking to a man with his arm in a sling. One of those women, Janice Ott, was seen accompanying the young man who called himself Ted. She was never seen again. Many years later, it was discovered she had fallen prey to serial killer Ted Bundy. On the morning of July 14, 1974, 23-year-old Janice Ott had spent a few hours washing her clothes at a laundromat and enjoyed a cup of coffee with a friend she met there. After these chores were done, Ott went home to her apartment at 75 Front Street in Issaquah and got ready to go enjoy the sunny weather at the beach. She put on a black bikini, cut-off shorts, and a white blouse tied at her midriff, then scribbled a short note to let her roommate know where she was going. "I'll be at Lake Sammamish soon and myself. See ya," she wrote. Janice then hopped on her 10-speed yellow Tiger bike and made her way to the park. Lake Sammamish, located in Issaquah, a suburb outside of Seattle, was a popular destination for residents and those out of town to enjoy. It has several beaches and can get very crowded during the hot summer months. On the day Janice Ott chose to go there, Lake Sammamish was visited by many people who flocked there to enjoy the summer weather. Most were either on the beach, walking their dogs, enjoying picnics, or sailing boats. That same day, an annual summer picnic was being hosted by the Rainier Beer Company, and it was reported there were as many as 40,000 people at Lamb Sam on that warm, summer's day. One of those at the park that day was a young dark-haired man with his arm in a sling, who was seen talking to many different women and girls. After arriving at the park, around 12:25 p.m., Janice Ott was seen by several people who later recalled the pretty young newlywed as she removed a towel from her bag, removing her blouse and shorts, and then applied a layer of cocoa butter to her skin. She was only there for 20 minutes when the dark-haired man with his left arm in a beige sling approached. He was, according to witnesses, dressed in a white shirt, tennis shorts, and tennis shoes. They had a brief exchange, and those closest could hear the young man asking Ott for assistance with putting a sailboat on his car. "It was just down the road at his parents' house," he explained. Janice invited the man to sit next to her so they could talk about it. Witnesses later told police how they overheard Janice telling the handsome stranger how she always had an interest in sailing, but had never learnt. She then asked the man, in a flirtatious way, if she could have a ride in the boat, and appeared to agree in helping the man if he would take her out on the water afterwards. Before they got up to go, Janice was heard telling the man that she had her bike with her, and she was worried about leaving it for fear it might get stolen. The man assured there was room for her bike in the trunk of his car, and Ott then told the man, "Okay, I'll help you." As the two started to walk away from Tibbetts Beach, one witness remembered Janice say, "Hi, I'm Jan," to which the man responded, "Hi, I'm Ted." It was the last time Janice Ott was seen alive again. Born on February 14, 1951, to Dr. Donald and Farrell Blackburn, Janice Ott had grown up in McMinnville, Oregon, with her sister Ilona Lynn. The Blackburn family were prosperous, with Donald Blackburn earning his doctorate degree from the University of Idaho, before working as a high school teacher and coach in Idaho. Janice's father then went on to work as a counselor and administrator in Washington State, specifically at the Spokane School No. 81. Alongside his teaching work, Dr. Blackburn and his father owned and operated a Pepsi-Cola bottling company in McMinnville, Oregon. Following in her father's footsteps, Janice graduated from Shadow Park High School with high honors and went on to earn her bachelor's in social work from Eastern Washington State University. Standing at only 5 feet 1 inch and weighing less than 100 pounds, Janice was a petite girl with long blonde hair and green eyes. She was known affectionately as Jan by family and friends, while her co-workers the well-liked Janice was called the Sunshine Girl because of her bright and bubbly personality. Working as a probation case worker with the King County Youth Service Center, she married Jim Ott in December 1973. With her husband in graduate school in California, Janice decided to move out of Seattle. This was, in part, because of an incident where her car was broken into, and she felt living in a smaller community might be safer. By 1974, she was living at 75 Front Street in Issaquah, and from there she decided to go to Lake Sammamish State Park on the fateful summer's day. After she was reported missing by her family, it was learned by police that Janice was one of two women who vanished from Lake Sammamish that day. Two women who were seemingly taken by the same handsome stranger named Ted. With two women believed kidnapped in broad daylight, with hundreds of potential witnesses, police expected to gather plenty of witness statements from those who saw and heard Janice before she was taken. 3 people close to where was sunbathing saw the young man approach, and all described the same person. He was a young white male, attractive and personable, wearing a white tennis outfit and with his left arm in a beige sling. He reportedly spoke with an accent, possibly Canadian or British, and asked for help in unloading his sailboat from his car. Those who overheard the conversation said the man called himself Ted. From these witness statements, police put together a composite sketch of the suspected kidnapper, while detectives gathered as much information about Janice's last moments with the stranger. Teresa Marie Sharp came forward to say how she was in close proximity to Ott, and recounted for investigators what she heard. Sharp went on to give a detailed description about the exchange she observed between the two strangers and what exactly was said. She said she suspected the man was feigning his injury, saying she didn't feel his arm was really hurt. I do remember he took his arm out of the sling and moved it around. Sat closest to Ott was 15-year-old Sylvia Valent, who told police the man was roughly 5 feet 6 inches to 5 feet 7 inches in height, and gave a similar physical description to other witnesses. Valent was able to tell police, word for word, the conversation between Ott and the stranger, and gave details those no other witness did. Although further away from where Janice was sat, Jerry Snyder, an off-duty DEA agent, saw the young man approach others on the beach that day. Snyder said he seemed only to ask women for help, never any men nearby, and that specifically he was trying to find someone who met certain qualifications. Sitting roughly 30 feet away, Snyder overheard some of the exchange with Ott and Ted. He said, "I noticed a guy that was walking down the beach. A young man, probably in his mid to late 20s. He was wearing white shorts and they had a red stripe, which immediately caught my eye. When he got close, I noticed he had really curly hair and his left arm was in a sling. It piqued my interest because every time he approached a woman or a group of 2 or 3 women, he was getting turned down. And I just kept watching him, and he eventually ended up being right in front of me, where he approached a young girl. She was a young and attractive blonde girl. And he asked her words to the effect of, 'I need some help. She's saying that she just got here.' So obviously, going through her mind is, 'I'd like to help you out, but I'm here to relax.' He kept on and on and on, and he talks her into whatever he talked her into. He said something about a catamaran, and ultimately she gets up reluctantly, because her head is down and she is like, 'I can't believe I'm doing this.' And then she started walking back past me. She had this frown on her face, like, 'I'm helping this guy when I should be enjoying myself on the beach.' In the end, the result is she's no longer with us because she was a nice person." Snyder and others watched as Janice walked off with the stranger. These 3 witnesses observed Janice from the moment she arrived on the beach and positioned herself between them until she walked away. Jerry Snyder was sat with his wife about 15 feet from where Valent was laying on the beach with her 2 friends. Teresa Sharp was with her family about 10 feet from Valent, and all were situated on the beach about 200 yards directly in front of the east restroom. 4 other young women came forward to report to police how they too had been approached by the man with his arm in a sling, who asked for their help. One of those, 22-year-old Janice Graham, said she was approached by the man at the bandstand area at around 12:15 p.m., and after he said hello and introduced himself as Ted, the man asked her help in loading a sailboat onto the top of his car. Although she initially agreed, Graham quickly realized there was no sailboat when they reached his vehicle, a tan-colored Volkswagen Beetle. She told the man she would be unable to help as she was meant to meet her parents and husband shortly. The man replied, "Oh, that's okay. I should have told you that it wasn't in the parking lot." He then walked Janice Graham back to the bandstand area, apologizing one last time before walking away to his right. Graham told police the stranger, who called himself Ted, was wearing a beige sling, and during the journey to his car, rubbed his injured arm 3 times, claiming it was from a racquetball injury. Other women reported encounters with the same man hours later. Only Graham accompanied the man to his vehicle, the others declined. Immediately after he parted ways with her, the man came across Janice Ott, who accepted his request for help, and seemingly accepted his excuse that his sailboat was elsewhere, causing her to accompany him away from Issaquah. Some 4 hours after Janice went missing, another young woman, 19-year-old Denise Naslund, also disappeared. With the description of the suspect, police printed the composite sketch in regional newspapers and broadcast the incident on local television. Tips soon started to come in from the public. One name cropped up on as many as 4 different reports, that of Ted Bundy. At the time, Bundy was a law student with no criminal record. Those who reported him, namely his own girlfriend at the time, Elizabeth Klopfer, a former co-worker in Rule, a fellow co-worker at his current employment at the DS office, and a University of Washington psychology professor, all said Bundy looked like the sketch. Similarly, Bundy owned a Volkswagen Beetle, the vehicle the suspect was reported to own, and which was observed by Janice Graham. However, as detectives were receiving as many as 200 tips per day, they decided to rule out Bundy, a clean-cut law student, as a possible kidnapping and murder suspect. The disappearances of Janice Ott and Denise Naslund were among 8 cases of missing women in Washington state, starting in January 1974. The other women, Linda and Healy, Donna Manson, Susan Rancourt, Roberta Parks, Brenda Ball, and Georgianne Hawkins, were all college-aged women, pretty, and with their hair parted in the middle. These similarities between the missing young women were not lost on some investigators. Many detectives suspected the same perpetrator might be responsible for most, if not all, of the disappearances. But with few leads and hundreds, even thousands of tips to follow up on, detectives hoped some, if not all, of the missing women would reappear alive and well. These hopes were dashed on September 6th, when a pair of grouse hunters stumbled across the skeletal remains scattered amongst a grassy patch in a wooded area near Issaquah, roughly 17 miles east of Seattle and 2 miles from Lake Sammamish. The area was immediately sealed off, and King County Police conducted a 3-day search of the area. Searchers came across 2 skulls, as well as some other bones, teeth, and tufts of reddish blonde and dark brown hair. The remains, which were by that time fully decomposed, had been dispersed throughout the forest by critters. There were no clothing or other personal affects with the remains to indicate the identity. Samples were taken and tested against the missing women, which were soon identified as those of Janice Ott and Denise Naslund. Detectives believed that both women had been left naked at the site by their killer, which would account for the lack of clothing. 6 months later, more remains found on Taylor Mountain. These were believed to be those of Healy, Rancourt, Parks, and Ball. Other bones found later at the same site as the discovery of Ott and Naslund's remains would eventually be identified as those of Hawkins. Under the most distressing of circumstances, the missing women had finally been found. Almost a year after the remains of Janice Ott, Denise Naslund and Georgianne Hawkins were discovered in Issaquah. A young man was arrested driving his Volkswagen Beetle through a Utah suburb. Ted Bundy, the same man whose name had been given to police by 4 people, one being his own girlfriend, had been caught driving suspiciously. During his arrest, Bundy's car was searched by officers, who found a variety of items they thought were burglary tools. These included gloves, a screwdriver, a flashlight, and an ASCII mask. However, they also found inside the black duffel bag rope, strips of cloth, wire, large green plastic bags, and a pair of handcuffs. After his arrest, Bundy was identified by Carol Duranch as the man responsible for her attempted abduction in November 1974. While police built a case against Bundy, he was released on bail and then sold his Volkswagen Bug to a teenaged boy. It was soon seized by police, who conducted a thorough forensic search of the vehicle. Inside they found evidence that tied Ted Bundy to other cases of missing women in both Washington and Utah. Hair samples were collected that matched 4 different missing women, one of which was Karen Campbell, who vanished from Snowmass in Colorado in January 1975 and was later found bludgeoned to death a month later. In June 1976, Bundy was found guilty of the attempted kidnapping of Carol Duranch and sentenced to between 1 and 15 years. Investigators now began to gather evidence that linked Ted Bundy to as many as 8 disappearances in Washington and another 5 in Utah. Through solid detective work, Bundy was placed in the area where the 2 women vanished. Investigators were aware that Bundy had been in the area the weekend before the Lake Sammamish disappearances, that were eventually able to place him in Issaquah at the time of Janice Ott's kidnapping, by matching up his credit card receipts to where he filled up at a local gas station located at the northwest corner of the intersection of Front Street and Sunset Way. It was speculated that before the abductions, Ted Bundy visited the Issaquah Press, where he purchased a newspaper. After his arrest and conviction, the bookkeeper insisted it was to Bundy she had sold a copy of the newspaper. The Issaquah Press was located only 2 doors down from where Janice was living at the time. On July 7th, Ted Bundy told his girlfriend he had been invited to a water skiing party at Lake Sammamish State Park. This was false, however, as Bundy was seen at Lake Sammamish by several people who knew him from Republican Party functions. He was reportedly seen walking along the beach alone. When these acquaintances saw him, they asked what he was doing. Bundy replied that he was just walking around. When they invited him skiing, he declined, saying he had no shorts. 4 days later, Bundy called in sick to work at the DS office, telling his supervisor Neil Miller that he had a cold. On the morning of Sunday, July 14, 1974, Bundy unexpectedly arrived at his girlfriend Liz Cloper's house and asked what his plans were for that day. She recalled he seemed particularly interested in where she was going. She told him about a small park she intended on going and hoped he would join her there, but he never did. This was the same day Janice went missing from Lake Sammamish. Instead, Ted Bundy made his way to Lake Sammamish, where thousands of other people were already arriving. He turned up wearing a white tennis outfit and with his arm placed inside a beige sling. After parking his Volkswagen in the parking lot, he made his way to the crowded beach. It was then that he came upon Janice Ott, as she lay in her black bikini soaking up the sun on Lake Sammamish's Tibbetts Beach. By the time he returned to work at the DS office on July 22nd, the composite sketch of the Lake Sammamish suspect, who called himself Ted, had been released by the Seattle Times. Bundy would take a great amount of banter from the other workers at the office, who all commented how much the composite of Ted resembled Bundy. They joked, "Gee Ted, you sure look a lot like that guy, and you own a Volkswagen." One of those DES employees reported Bundy to police as a potential suspect in the Lake Sammamish disappearances, while his girlfriend Liz was growing increasingly worried about what her boyfriend might be capable of. While police in Washington and Utah sought Bundy for questioning, other jurisdictions such as Oregon and Idaho also wanted to talk to him about missing person cases in their states. By the time of his conviction in Florida, Bundy was a suspect in the disappearance or deaths of as many as 36 women and young girls. During his imprisonment, Bundy planned an escape that lasts several days. After his recapture, he made a further successful attempt that saw him make his way to Florida, where he committed more murders. During his attack on the Chi Omega sorority house, Bundy killed 2 women and injured another 2, while a third was attacked several houses away. In February 1978, he was captured after committing his last murder, that of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. For these crimes, Bundy would be sentenced to death twice during 2 separate trials. With Ted Bundy on death row, he became the focus of interviewers and behavioral experts who wished to understand the psychology and pathology behind his crimes. Not long after he was incarcerated, Bundy agreed to a series of interviews to discuss the murders, for which he continued to deny involvement. While on death row in March 1980, Ted Bundy, suspected by many law enforcement investigators of being a serial killer, agreed a series of interviews conducted by journalists Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth. As part of the interview process, Bundy agreed to talk about the crimes in the third-person perspective. This gave him a chance to discuss his crimes, while not directly implicating himself in anything that might result in additional murder charges. During one of the interviews that spanned several days over the space of a few months, he was asked directly about the Lake Sammamish abductions of Janice Ott and Denise Naslund. He put forward the theory that one of the women would probably have watched the other die. This would have meant that after Bundy abducted Janice Ott, he kept her alive for the next 4 hours, until his later kidnapping of Denise Naslund. He then killed one, while making the other watch before her own death. For Bundy, it was possibly the first he had orchestrated the kidnapping and murder of 2 women on the same day. It was a distinct and drastic divergence of his usual MO, as was his approaching potential victims during the day, when there were so many witnesses present that could identify him and his Volkswagen. It is possible that by this stage in his murder spree, Bundy thought himself almost impervious to the police investigation. After all, he had committed, up to that point, as many as 6 murders without getting caught. The only other time he attempted to take 2 women during the same day was when his aborted attack on Carol Duranch caused him to seek out another victim later the evening. Bundy would later speculate further during his discussions with FBI Special Agent Bill Hagmaier and seemed to confirm what he had told Michaud and Ainsworth, namely that either Janice Ott and Denise Naslund had watched the other die. He then went on to say how after he had killed Ott and Naslund, he dumped their bodies along the side of a service road near Issaquah. What he never explained, however, was the exact location he held them, or where the murders occurred. Police theorized Bundy had likely bound Janice Ott after his abduction, and possibly raped her during the 4-hour period between her kidnapping and his return to Lake Sammamish, where he lured away Denise Naslund. If he did leave Ott alive somewhere, it would have likely been a secluded spot, where she was unlikely to be discovered. It is also entirely plausible that Bundy murdered Ott, then returned to abduct Naslund for some other reason. It is possible he had not gained sufficient sexual gratification from the act of killing Ott, which caused him to require another victim. It could also be argued that Bundy had set out to murder 2 women that day, spending a sufficient amount of time with Janice Ott, before his urge to kill overcame him, and he sought to carry out his second abduction. By 4 p.m., almost 4 hours after he kidnapped Janice Ott, Bundy returned to Lake Sammamish and was seen talking to Denise Naslund. Less than 24 hours before his execution in January 1989, Bundy confessed to both Janice Ott and Denise Naslund's murders. He then went on to share more details with FBI agent Hagmeyer about Janice Ott's death. He confessed that he drove Ott, who was unconscious, to a secluded cabin roughly 2 to 3 miles from Lake Sammamish. There, he said he raped her repeatedly before knocking her out again and tying her up. He said when he returned with Naslund, Otto had at some point regained consciousness. He said he then raped and murdered Naslund in front of her, before eventually killing Ott. He said that after a while, murder is not just a crime of lust or violence, Hagmeyer related. It becomes possession. They are part of you. The victim becomes a part of you, and you two are forever one. And the grounds where you kill them or leave them become sacred to you, and you will always be drawn back to them. Bundy confessed to returning to the sites where he placed his victims and carried out acts of necrophilia with the remains. It is possible he returned to the Issaquah dump site to engage in such action with Janice Ott remains. Despite these last-minute confessions, Bundy's scheduled execution was carried out, and he went to Florida's Old Sparky electric chair on January 24, 1989. The disappearances at Lake Sammamish shocked the community, which had already seen a number of young, pretty women vanished without trace. The significance of Janice Ott's abduction would prove critical in the ongoing investigation into the capture of Ted Bundy, and meant many more victims were likely saved from the prolific predator. Because Bundy had approached a number of women before Ott agreed to go with him, meant that for the first time, law enforcement had credible and accurate descriptions of the abductor, known as Ted. With that information, they were able to compile a composite sketch that resembled Ted Bundy, so much so that people who knew him decided to report his likeness to investigators. If it had remained in Washington, it is possible Bundy would have been caught sooner. His name was on several lists of suspects, namely those who owned a Volkswagen Beetle, and police were closing in on him. However, his sudden relocation to Utah contributed to his continued freedom and the rash of disappearances that followed in Utah. In the years following their daughter's murder, the Blackburns became involved in an ongoing legal fight against the Kings County Sheriff's Office over Janice's remains. Police had told the families of Ott and Denise Naslund that the remains of their loved ones could not be turned over for burial because they were evidence in an ongoing investigation. The truth, however, was much more sinister. The remains of both women had, in actuality, been misplaced. Both families filed a lawsuit against the county in 1984, but before a trial could begin in December, an out-of-court settlement was reached. The Blackburns had originally sought $4 million alongside James Ott. As part of the settlement, they received significantly less, around $112,500, the same that was offered to Denise Naslund's parents. The settlement never brought closure for the family of Janice Ott, whose remains could never be buried properly. They could, however, take comfort in the knowledge that her killer had faced justice for his crimes. Case 11. On July 1, 1975, Shelley Robertson failed to show up at her family-run business in Colorado. She was last seen that same day, in the company of an unknown man. As the week went by, with no word of her whereabouts, her family feared the worst. On August 23, 1975, her remains were found. Detectives who worked the case had a prime suspect, serial killer Ted Bundy. Using their flashlights, two students from the Colorado School of Mines peered into the narrow tunnel that was enveloped in darkness. They had come to the mine shaft at Berthoud Pass, Colorado, near the Winter Park Resort, to conduct Amex testing for gas content. After making their way inside about 500 feet, they suddenly smelled something. It was the unmistakable scent of human decomposition. As they strained to see ahead, they saw something strange up ahead. It was large and white. When they inspected it further, they realized what they were looking at. First they noticed a foot, then the bare buttocks of a woman. The two students quickly made their way out of the mine to get help. When officers from the Clear Creek County Sheriff's Office arrived at the mine, 2 days later, on August 23, 1975, they found the naked, decomposing remains of a young woman. The body had been discarded in the mine shaft and was badly molded and bound with duct tape. It was determined the woman had been struck on the head, which was most likely the cause of death. The only personal effect found on the body was a single earring. There was little evidence at the scene, except for 2 torn pieces of furnace tape, one of which was on the body and the other discarded nearby, along with a discarded beer can and a plastic wrapper from a package of ham. Detectives didn't know it at that time, but they had just found the body of Shelley Robertson, who had vanished without trace. Robertson was last seen 7 weeks earlier, and when she failed to turn up for work, she was reported missing. At the time of her disappearance and the discovery of her body, Colorado and other northwestern states had seen many young women go missing, with some turn up dead. Most of those were victims of serial killer Ted Bundy, and investigators suspected his involvement in the murder of Shelley Robertson. Born on July 24, 1951, in Arvada, Colorado, Shelley K. Robertson was one of 4 children to Elmer and Roberta Robertson, who had 3 young sons, Mark, Gary, and Rick. At some point during their childhood, the Robertsons divorced and Elmer remarried. As the owner of Silver State Printers, Elmer ran a family business, with both Shelley and her brother Gary helping out, where she worked as a bookkeeper and binder. After her graduation from Arvada High School in 1969, Shelley spent a year in Biloxi, Mississippi, on a missionary trip run through the United Church of Christ. An active member of the Church of Christ, she was encouraged by her mother to travel and experience the world. Roberta often told her daughter that you can always come back to your hometown. Upon her return to Colorado, she enrolled in Red Rocks Community College as a Spanish major, and her class spent a semester abroad in Barra de Navidad, a Mexican fishing village. She would return there once again to visit on her own. Shelley then spent a year traveling in Alaska with her friend Susan, where they worked processing fish in Clam Gulch. By 1975, Shelley was living with her boyfriend Ron, and together they had an apartment in Denver, Colorado. As July approached, Ron had made plans to go to California, something that upset Shelley. On June 28th, Shelley had reportedly gotten into a fight with Ron, which caused her to get out of his red Carmen Gia and thumb a ride home. Hitchhiking was something Shelley Robertson did often, and thought nothing of catching a ride if she needed to get somewhere. Because it was something she did frequently, neither her boyfriend or friends thought it strange, despite the dangers involved. She was last seen a day later, when friends saw her near a local watering hole called Tony's Bar, located in Golden, Colorado. She reported as wearing bell-bottom jeans, a t-shirt with the name of a rock band on the front, and hiking boots. However, this was not the last time Shelley Robertson was seen. Another sighting of her was reported, this time at 34th and Sheridan Streets in Denver, where she was seen hitchhiking to work. When she failed to show up for work at her father's printing press in Golden, she was reported as missing. The last confirmed sighting of her alive occurred that same day, when she was believed to have been seen by a policeman who noticed her at a service station. She was in the company of a stranger who was described as a bushy-haired bearded man who was driving a beat-up old red Chevrolet pickup truck from around 1952 to 57. Unconfirmed reports allege that Shelley made a phone call later that night. After that, nothing more was heard from her. Shelley Robertson was described as 5 feet 8 inches tall, slim build, with hazel eyes and long brown hair parted in the middle. Police began a search, but with little clues pointing to her whereabouts, they made little progress. It would be 7 weeks before anyone would discover what happened to Shelley Robertson. Not until her naked body was found discarded inside an abandoned mine shaft at Berthoud Pass. And even then, police faced the difficult task of trying to determine how she came to end up there, and who was responsible for her murder. When her body was identified, Clear Creek County Sheriff Gene Kiefer spoke to the press about the discovery. Kiefer said it was determined that Shelley had been dead for about 60 days when she was found by amateur spelunkers. During the autopsy, the coroner said bruising about her head were consistent with being beaten, but could not determine if it was the cause of death. During the course of the investigation, police looked at numerous suspects, including several serial killers. Otis Toole was looked into, but soon ruled out after it was learned he was in Jacksonville, Florida at the time, where he was drifting and carrying out a series of murders that would see him captured and imprisoned. Another suspect was convicted double murderer and suspected serial killer Warren Forrest, who was quickly ruled out because he was incarcerated in 1974 for the murder of 20-year-old Krista K. Blake, a hitchhiker who disappeared from Vancouver on July 11, 1974, and whose body was found on July 16, 1976, in Tukes Mountain, Portland. Detectives also looked into Jake Tepler, a graduate of Tufts University and a resident of the nearby Snowmass Village, who was a former employee of a condominium complex, described as a nomad who wandered the area, going from one job to another, and never keeping one for long. A former coworker reported that Tepler was very sick, the kind of person who would go in the corner and jack off. Police soon ruled out Tepler, who had no criminal record. Others ruled out of the investigation included a man in Shelley's transactional analysis group that claimed, oddly enough, that he was alive during the Civil War, a quiet friend of hers that, coincidentally, drove a Volkswagen Beetle, and a man described as a chronic sex offender that lived nearby. However, one person in particular has persisted as the most likely killer of Shelley Robertson. Just 6 weeks after Shelley Robertson was last seen, a patrolman in Utah arrested the driver of a suspicious vehicle in Granger, a Salt Lake City suburb. The man, Ted Bundy, was a student at the law school at the University of Utah and claimed he was lost in the residential area after attending a drive-in movie theater. Because Bundy had driven away from the officer at high speed and without his headlights on, his car, a Volkswagen Beetle, was searched. The police found the front passenger seat had been removed and placed on the rear seats, while a search of the trunk uncovered a variety of items that caused the officers some alarm. Inside a black duffel bag, they found a flashlight, crowbar, ski mask, a pair of gloves, a pantyhose mask, rope, a pair of handcuffs, wire, a screwdriver, an ice pick, strips of cloth, and large green plastic bags. He was immediately placed under arrest on suspicion of carrying burglary tools. His car had already been suspected of involvement in an earlier case of attempted kidnapping against a young woman named Carol Duranch. In a search of his Utah apartment, detectives found a guide to Colorado ski resorts with a checkmark by the Wildwood Inn, from where Karen Campbell had disappeared on January 12, 1975, and was later found dead, as well as a brochure that advertised the Viewmont High School play in Bountiful, from where Debbie Kent had disappeared November 8, 1974. Without any solid evidence of his involvement in these crimes, Ted Bundy was released but placed under surveillance. His girlfriend, Liz Klopfer, was questioned by detectives and gave them testimony of unusual behavior exhibited by Bundy that she could not explain. She suspected his involvement in a series of missing women in Washington in 1974. When Bundy sold his Volkswagen Beetle, police impounded it and carried out forensic tests which found hairs that matched Karen Campbell. Other hairs were identified as belonging to Carol Duranch and Melissa Smith, who vanished on October 18, 1974 in Utah. Detectives then began looking to Ted Bundy's life to determine if he was, in fact, a serial killer. While conducting the search of Ted Bundy's Volkswagen, investigators reportedly found crumpled-up credit card receipts that placed him in Golden, either a few days before or on the day of Shelley Robertson's disappearance. Other sources, such as the 1992 Ted Bundy multi-agency report, puts him in Salt Lake City during that time frame. With no evidence of Bundy's involvement in Shelley Robertson's abduction, he was not immediately questioned by detectives investigating her murder. Bundy was put on trial for the kidnapping of Carol Duranch and was found guilty and sentenced to between 1 and 15 years. Afterwards, he faced the prospect of charges for the murder of Karen Campbell in Colorado. During his imprisonment in Utah, as he awaited extradition to Colorado, Cold Creek County Undersheriff Bob Denning traveled to Salt Lake City to interview Bundy about the murder of Shelley Robertson. During the discussion, Bundy reportedly told Denning, "I don't want to talk about that," when asked about her murder. Denning would later go on to say that he is 99% sure that Shelley's killer is Ted Bundy. On June 27, 1975, just a few days before Shelley Robertson was last seen, Bundy abducted and murdered Susan Curtis while she attended a youth conference at Brigham Young University in Salt Lake City. For days after Shelley was last seen on July 4, 1975, another woman went missing. Nancy Baird was abducted from the gas station where she worked in East Layton, Utah, and was never seen or heard from again. While incarcerated in Aspen, Bundy would escape twice from his jail cell. During his second escape, he traveled to Florida, where he committed the murders of Lisa Levy, Margaret Bowman, 2 Chi Omega sorority sisters, and later 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. For these murders, Bundy would be sentenced to death twice in 2 separate trials. During his time of death row, he refused to admit his guilt, claiming he had committed none of the murders for which he had been convicted. Ted Bundy was suspected by police of involvement in as many as 30 murders of young women, one of whom was Shelley Robertson. Shelley was last seen in the company of an unknown male described as a bushy-haired bearded man, who drove a beat-up old red Chevrolet pickup truck. Ted Bundy was known to change his appearance by growing a beard and wore his hair long. It is also known that around this time, he did own an old pickup truck until about November/December 1975. In the last days before his execution, in January 1989, Bundy confessed to numerous unsolved murders, including 8 known murders in Washington, 5 in Utah and 3 in Colorado, amongst others. Some sources claim he confessed to the murder of Shelley Robertson shortly before he was put to death. The Robertson family struggled to adapt after Shelley was taken from them. Her brother Mark was also taken from the family at a young age, when he died the same age as Shelley was when she was murdered. Mrs. Robertson talked about her daughter growing up, saying how Shelley dreamed that one day a white horse would come into her life and she would name him Brownie. One day Shelley Robertson's dream came true when she became enamored with a neighbor's horse. One day, the young girl came running into her house shouting to her mother, "There's a white horse out there." The horse belonged to a rodeo clown, and when he heard about her dream, he helped Shelley get a little filly she named Bonnie, which she rode the dove gray mare bareback as she grew up. When Ted Bundy was finally executed in January 1989, Roberta Robertson traveled from Colorado to Florida, where she stood in a crowd outside the prison to wait for word of his death. Interviewed by a journalist, she said, "Killing Ted Bundy won't make me feel better, and it won't bring back Shelley. A lot of people seem to want it out of a vengeance, but it gives people a false sense of security, and it's terribly expensive." On March 5, 2013, a Facebook account named Missing Parents appeared, created by 2 siblings, Chow Hoi-ying and Chow Hoi-lung, in an attempt to find their missing parents. According to the provided information, the missing father was Chow Wing-ki, who was last seen wearing a dark blue suit, a long-sleeved shirt, and jeans, carrying a crossbody bag. The mother, Tsuyu Yet-yi, was wearing a light-colored sweater and jeans, also carrying a crossbody bag. Both had been missing since March 2nd, after informing their children that they were going on a trip to the mainland. After several days of being unable to contact their parents, Chow Hoi-ying grew uneasy and decided to post about their disappearance on social media. In contrast to his brother's concern, Chow Hoi-lung remained quite calm when discussing their parents' disappearance. He insisted that he had gone with his parents to a tea house, and a few days later, he was the one who escorted them to the train station for their trip, making it unlikely that anything bad had happened. Hoi-lung reassured his brother that their parents were probably just enjoying their trip and didn't want to be disturbed, which was why they had turned off their phones and cut off communication. However, Chow Hoi-ying still felt that something was wrong, so he decided to report the case to the police. After receiving the missing person report from Chow Hoi-ying, the police began their investigation and immediately discovered several serious inconsistencies. The first was contradictions in Chow Hoi-lung's statements. Chow Hoi-lung claimed he had gone to a tea house with his parents, but security footage from the restaurant showed no signs of them being there at that time. The second was irregularities in the exit records. When police checked the departure records of Chow Wing-ki and Xu Yu-yi, they found that the couple had never actually left Hong Kong. This completely contradicted Chow Hoi-lung's claim that his parents had traveled to the mainland. Finally, the police couldn't ignore Chow Hoi-lung's unusual behavior during the interrogation. When summoned to clarify the contradictions in his statements, Chow Hoi-lung firmly insisted that the information he provided was true. However, his behavior throughout the interrogation was highly suspicious. His hands trembled, his eyes darted around, and he drank an excessive amount of water, as if trying to ease his anxiety. Based on these anomalies, The police immediately realized that Chow Hoi Lung was deliberately hiding something most likely. He knew exactly where his parents were. At first, Chow Hoi Lung continuously denied all accusations, insisting that his parents were simply away on a trip. He stubbornly stuck to his story, even appearing confused and blaming the situation. However, after several intense interrogations and immense pressure from investigators, Chow Hoi Lung eventually broke down under psychological stress and made a shocking confession. The Chow couple was dead, and he was the one who had murdered his own parents. But that wasn't even the most horrifying part. Killing them was just the first step in a much more sinister plan that Hoi Lung had been preparing for a long time. On March 15, 2013, when police raided Chow Hoi Lung's apartment, they couldn't believe what they saw. The darkened room had become the scene of a gruesome crime, more horrifying than anything from a horror movie. On the floor, a box contained dismembered body parts, all covered in a thick layer of white salt, as if they were being preserved. In the corner of the room stood two large refrigerators, and when officers opened them, they were horrified as two frozen, stiff heads tumbled out. Inside the fridge, human organs were neatly arranged. In fact, at first glance, one might mistake them for pieces of processed animal meat. The most terrifying discovery was the neatly packed bags of minced meat that looked just like barbecue pork, except the meat inside wasn't pork, it was human flesh. The police were further horrified when they found human tissue remains inside the microwave and rice cooker. What exactly had Hoi Lung done to his parents? Investigators quickly found the answer when they discovered a small notebook hidden under Chow Hoi Lung's bed. Inside, they found a meticulously detailed plan written by Chow Hoi Lung, outlining every step of how he murdered his parents, along with a step-by-step recipe for making the horrifying barbecue pork lunchboxes. Not only had he killed his parents, but he had also turned their bodies into food, an act so depraved that only the most deranged individuals could commit it. The police immediately arrested Chow Hoi Lung, determined to bring this monstrous criminal to justice. When the first reports of the case surfaced, it wasn't the victim's relatives, or even the killer's own family who were the most shocked. Friends and acquaintances had long feared Hoi Lung, believing him to be extremely dangerous due to his unpredictable personality and depression. They had always suspected he would commit a crime sooner or later, but no one could have imagined he would commit such a brutal act against his own parents. However, those most horrified were the general public, who learned about the case through the media. When the gruesome details were revealed, people were not only outraged, but also felt nauseous whenever they saw barbecue pork. Taking the lives of those who gave birth to him was already appalling, yet this young murderer went even further. He desecrated their bodies and turned them into food for himself. Just when people thought this was the peak of his cruelty, another shocking revelation from the killer once again sent shockwaves through the public. It turned out that Chow Hoi Lung hadn't carried out this plan alone. On the contrary, the crime had been meticulously planned with the strong support of a close friend, Se Chun Kei, a key figure in the case. Killing his parents, and even turning them into food just because of something his best friend said? Can you believe it? I'm sure that if anyone had a friend who dared to suggest such a thing, they would be beaten to a pulp, let alone manipulated into actually doing it. But ironically, Hoi Lung did the exact opposite of what most people would. A few days before executing his plan to kill his parents, Chow Hoi Lung met with Se Chun Kei, his closest friend at the time. Feeling sad and depressed, Chow Hoi Lung confided in Se Chun Kei about his extreme decision, saying that he no longer wanted to live. However, Se Chun Kei's advice was not encouragement, but the ignition of a deadly idea. Se Chun Kei not only suggested that Chow Hoi Lung was a victim of life, but also implied that his parents were the true culprits who had pushed him into this tragedy. Se Chun Kei bluntly stated that if Chow Hoi Lung wanted to free himself from his suffering, he had to kill his parents. As long as they disappear, the police will assume they're dead, and their assets will belong to you, Se said with a calm demeanor. With his monstrous words of encouragement, Se Chun Kei not only failed to stop Chow Hoi Lung, but also became his accomplice, the one who incited and guided him down this blood-stained path. The anxiety over his mounting debts, combined with the encouragement from his best friend, led Chow Hoi Lung into a foggy state of greed and fear. Se Chun Kei's suggestions were like fuel to the fire, prompting Chow Hoi Lung to start planning his parents' murder without leaving a trace. Over the next 3 months, the two secretly devised a detailed plan to kill Chow's parents as silently as possible. The two deranged young men purchased knives, a refrigerator, a microwave, and a rice cooker, waiting for the right moment to strike. Before committing the crime, they chose Tse Chun Kei's apartment in Haixing Building, Tai Kok Sui, as the location. On March 1, 2013, after Chow Hoi Lung and Tse Chun Kei had prepared everything, Chow called his parents, telling them he had bought an apartment at Haixing Building, when in reality, it was Tse Chun Kei's home, and invited them over to see it. At 11:40 a.m., his parents arrived at Haixing Building and then entered an apartment on the third floor, as Chow Hoi Lung had arranged. Su Yi stepped inside first, but before she could even look at her son's new home, someone suddenly jumped out from behind the door and slashed her neck with a knife. Before she could even scream, the attacker struck her again in the stomach and back. At that moment, Chow Hoi Lung's father, Chow Wing-ki, realized what was happening after witnessing his wife being brutally murdered by Tse Chun Kei. But he never expected that his own son, Chow Hoi Lung, would suddenly appear before him, wielding a knife, ready to kill him. Chow Hoi Lung intended to kill his father the same way, but at just 164 centimeters, he lacked the strength to overpower him, leading to a violent struggle. After finishing off Su Yi, Tse Chun Kei quickly joined in to assist Chow Hoi Lung. With Tse Chun Kei restraining him, Chow Wing-ki was forced to the ground, before being stabbed in the neck and back. Working together, the two killed Chow Hoi Lung's parents in less than 20 minutes. However, even after murdering his own parents, Chow Hoi Lung was not satisfied. He went on to commit an act far more monstrous and revolting. With Tse Chun Kei's assistance, Chow decided not to leave the bodies intact. Instead, he planned to dismember them and turn them into barbecue pork. The two purchased 3 plastic containers, 7 knives, a hacksaw, and 6 large bags of salt, the perfect tools for their special menu. They used a microwave to heat body parts, soaked them in salt to prevent decomposition, and stored them in the refrigerator. At that point, the fridge was filled with horrifying barbecue pork lunchboxes. The police were utterly shocked by the brutal methods of Chow Hoi Lung. He had turned his own parents into grotesque dishes. The level of cruelty and depravity displayed by the killer far exceeded anything they had ever encountered in their careers. Truly, they had never faced a case as bizarre and haunting as this, where humanity had been completely erased, replaced by the boundless brutality of a man devoid of conscience. What exactly was the reason or conflict that led 29-year-old Chow Hoi Lung to such rebellion? When asked by the police why he killed his parents, Chow Hoi Lung suddenly burst into laughter. "You've all been fooled by them. Parents who won't even give their own son money. Can they really be considered good parents?" Based on his testimony and evidence provided by those involved, the police began to understand why Chow Hoi Lung harbored such resentment toward his parents. First, although Chow Hoi Lung was the youngest son and loved by his family, he had always felt inferior due to his short stature, growing up to be only 1.64 meters tall. His height issue had long been a source of frustration that Chow Hoi Lung couldn't overcome. He even started blaming his parents, believing that they were responsible for his short stature, which had robbed him of his dignity as a man. As a child, Chow Hoi Lung lived a luxurious life, with his parents spending a fortune on piano lessons for him. He was quite talented in music and always performed well. However, deep down, Chow Hoi Lung believed that his parents had made the wrong decision. He thought that if they had enrolled him in sports instead, he might have grown to be 1.8 meters tall. Later, his parents worked hard to send him abroad to study in Australia, hoping he would gain exposure to the wider world. But they never imagined that once out of their supervision, Chow Hoi Lung would completely lose control, skipping school, becoming addicted to video games, and causing trouble. Furthermore, during his time in Australia, Chow was repeatedly discriminated against, bullied, and even beaten on multiple occasions. In 2003, Chow Hoi Lung returned to Hong Kong for good as he was unable to complete his studies in Australia. Over the years, Chow Hoi Lung worked several jobs, including as a bank employee, an assistant manager, and a real estate consultant, careers generally considered respectable. Unfortunately, Chow Hoi Lung was inherently lazy, failing to perform well at work, and unable to stick with any job for long. Eventually, he quit working altogether, living off his parents' indulgence, and becoming a full-time freeloader. Because of his deep insecurities about his height, Chow Hoi Lung, now nearly 30 years old, had no confidence in finding a girlfriend. However, despite his misfortune in love, he still harbored a naive dream of becoming rich. When the stock market boomed a few years before the crime, Chow Hoi Lung, hoping to get rich overnight, eagerly jumped into trading. Lacking experience and expertise, he soon suffered a major failure. Due to reckless stock speculation, Chow Hoi Lung lost nearly $13,000. His parents later had to sell their house to pay off his debts. Considering that both Chow Hoi Ying and Chow Hoi Lung were already adults and of marriageable age, their parents carefully decided to use the money from selling the house to pay off debts and split the remaining amount between the two brothers, giving each around $50,000. However, despite being scammed, Chow Hoi Lung remained obsessed with stock trading and continued dreaming of getting rich. By 2013, he had lost more money and was deeply in debt again. He once again turned to his parents, demanding that they help him pay off his debts. He even urged his father to sell more of their properties. Chow Hoi Lung's incompetence greatly disappointed his parents. They firmly refused and insisted that he go out and find a job to repay his debts. After years of relying on his parents, he had lost the motivation to strive for success, making it difficult for him to step out of his comfort zone. His parents' refusal enraged Chow Hoi Lung, gradually fueling his resentment toward them. His hatred grew so intense that he even expressed his desire to kill his parents to his own cousin. Chow Hoi Lung stated that he had thought about traveling and murdering someone. He planned to end his own life before turning 30. However, after meeting someone named Ake, Chow changed his mind and decided he wanted to kill others instead. Chow no longer wanted to live because he disagreed with his parents, who had placed too many expectations on him, expectations he felt incapable of fulfilling. He also despised his older brother, who often beat him whenever their father scolded him. On August 4, 2014, the court held its first trial session with an initial panel of 7 jurors, which was later reduced to 6 during the first week of testimony. Shortly after, another juror requested to be excused due to psychological distress. Before the jury, Chow Hoi Lung claimed that his father was an arrogant man who had abandoned him, leaving him with no peace of mind. Meanwhile, his mother always appeared sorrowful because he had contributed nothing to the family. "If they die, I can be reborn," Chow Hoi Lung stated. On August 13, 2014, Deputy Judge Michael Stewart Moore announced that the trial would restart with a new 9-member jury. The proceedings resumed in February 2015. Throughout the trial, Chow Hoi Lung's defense attorney argued for a reduced sentence based on mental instability. However, the prosecution emphasized Chow Hoi Lung's meticulous planning and multiple confessions. On March 9, 2015, Chow Hoi Lung's defense lawyer, Nicholas Adams, summoned psychiatrist Chung Ka-Fai to testify. Dr. Chung diagnosed Chow Hoi Lung with bipolar disorder and obsessive-compulsive disorder. Dr. Chung stated that Chow Hoi Lung had repeatedly contemplated suicide after dropping out of university, being rejected by women, and experiencing unemployment. Louis Sing Hung, a consultant from the Su Lam Psychiatric Center, conducted IQ tests on both Chow Hoi Lung and Si Chung Koo. Chow Hoi Lung's IQ was found to be 126 higher than average, whereas Say's IQ was only 84. For reference, a typical IQ score falls between 85 and 115. Expert Louis Sing Hung argued that since Chow Hoi Lung had a higher IQ than Say, he may have manipulated and coerced Say into committing murder. On March 22, 2015, the trial for Chow Hoi Lung's parasite case concluded. Chow Hoi Lung was sentenced to life imprisonment for premeditated murder, while Say Chung Koo received a 1-year sentence for desecrating a corpse. As a young man with an IQ of 126, a privileged education, and the opportunity to study abroad, Chow Hoi Lung had a much better starting point than most people. However, due to his short stature and innate laziness, he lost the positive attitude he needed in life, ultimately making the grave mistake of murdering his parents. While Chow Hoi Lung's psychological imbalance and moral corruption were the primary causes of this tragedy, one could argue that his parents' overindulgence was also a contributing factor. The case of Chow Hoi Lung was not just a shocking crime. It posed a profound question about human nature and the extreme lengths to which cruelty can extend. Was his coldness and apathy merely a result of extreme circumstances, or was it an inherent trait that anyone could fall into when they lost control? The chilling case of Chow Hoi Lung, who murdered and cooked his own parents, became an inspiration for several films and TV productions. This horrifying story was reenacted in the 2-episode television drama Stained, which aired in 2017. The series, produced by Fox Networks Group Asia and directed by Patrick Kong, meticulously recreated the case with intense suspense. Additionally, the case was adapted into the 2018 TVB film OMG, Your Honor, reviving the public's fear of the crime. Most recently, in 2022, The Sparring Partner, a film based on Chow Hoi Lung's case and directed by Ho Chwek Tin, was released. The movie offered a fresh and in-depth perspective on the case, exploring various psychological and societal angles. It premiered at the 46th Hong Kong International Film Festival and officially hit theaters on October 27, 2022, garnering widespread public and critical discussion.